My 10-year high school reunion was coming up. I didn't originally plan on going, but my friends convinced me. The reunion was in August on a Saturday. It was organized by a group of people from our graduating class, and it was going to be held at some catering hall in a nice area of town. It had been a long time since I'd seen any of these people, minus my handful of friends from high school who I'd be going with. I really didn't want to go because I didn't like a lot of the people from my high school, and making small talk with 100 people I hadn't seen in 10 years sounded awful. But I also felt like if all my friends went and I didn't, I'd feel like I was missing out. When the night of the reunion finally came, I drove to my friend Kayla's house, and our two other friends Marissa and Sophia came as well. We were pre-gaming at her house, then we ended up calling an Uber from there. The reunion started around 8, so we got there fashionably late at 9. We stepped into the party hall, and right away familiar faces everywhere, only older looking versions of everyone. There had to be at least 80 to 100 people here, and it was more than I was expecting. Being with my friends made it easier to say hi to people I hadn't seen in forever. The vibe honestly was a bit different than I was expecting. There was a DJ, party lights, and a generally loud atmosphere, whereas what I was expecting was a quiet, intimate setting focused heavily on talking. People were getting really drunk at this, including my friends. We sat at a table with some other girls from high school. It was about 10 of us at the table. As the night progressed and everyone mingled and caught up with different people, I found myself feeling a bit awkward as my friends were doing their own things. I was alone at the table eating, and I noticed a guy who I didn't recognize at another table, looking in my direction. When we locked eyes, I looked away, but I wondered who he was. I glanced back for just a second and noticed he was still looking at me. Next thing I knew, he was coming over to sit next to me. He told me his name was Connor, and he started hitting on me immediately, saying he saw me across the room and couldn't help but come over and say hi. He was honestly decent looking, and I felt awkward sitting alone anyway, so I really didn't mind him sitting there. I said, "I don't recognize you. Did you go to our school?" He said, "Yeah, everyone's been saying that. I transferred to your guys' school our senior year. I didn't meet a lot of you." I basically said, "Oh, that's interesting. Who do you actually know here?" He replied that he's just friends with a couple guys who are also here. I asked their names, and he gave first names only. I guessed the last names, and he said yes to both as he laughed. We talked for a while until he asked for my number so that he could go back to his friends. I gave it to him and walked away. Overall impression was that he seemed normal and I enjoyed talking to him. Now I was left alone again, so after finishing my food and drink, I went to find my friends. They were all separated, talking with different people, some people who I wasn't the biggest fan of. I went over to Kayla, who was mid-conversation with a few people, and I joined the conversation. My friends were all wasted. I was definitely drunk, but not on their level. I kind of wanted to just go home. It almost felt like a saving grace when Connor texted me asking me if I needed a ride home since he's leaving. I texted him back, "Yes, please." He told me to meet him in the lobby of the building. So I looked around and then decided to just do an Irish exit. Too many people to say goodbye to. I saw Connor in the lobby by the front door. We walked to his car. It was a black two-door coupe. I honestly don't know what it was. I'm not a car person. He asked me to put my address into his phone. I thanked him for doing this as we started to drive. He pulled a couple water bottles from the back seat and handed me one, and he suggested I drink a lot of water to avoid a hangover tomorrow. So I started to sip some water. Suddenly my phone started blowing up. Kayla was calling me, and Marissa and Sophia were also texting me in our group chat. I didn't pick up the call, but I read their texts. They were asking where I went, and I told them I got a ride home. They kept pressing me, asking with who, and Kayla said check the Facebook group that organized the reunion. Then Marissa sent a screenshot of a post made by a girl in the Facebook group, warning everyone of a random guy who wasn't from our school going around talking to girls, introducing himself as a different name to everyone. Kayla tried calling me. I pressed decline and texted her I'm with this guy named Connor. She replied in all caps that someone said that she saw me leave with that guy. I wanted to actually vomit now. I looked at the guy, and then I evaluated the situation. I had to run when I had the chance. The next time we were stopped at a red light, I opened the door and said I gotta go and ran as fast as I could. I ran into this parking lot of a TGI Fridays. He didn't chase after me, he just kept driving. I called Kayla back right then and there, She told me to wait here. They'd all Uber over here and pick me up. I waited in this parking lot for like 15 to 20 minutes until they arrived. By this point, I started feeling extremely drunk, lightheaded, and a foggy memory. I believe he had put something in that water bottle to try and sedate me. Thankfully, I didn't drink that much. The worst part about this was that the guy now had my apartment address. We all slept at Kayla's house that night. The next morning, I drove home, but shortly after entering my apartment, there was a knock at my door. I freaked out thinking it was that guy, but I saw it was my neighbor through the window. I opened the door, and my neighbor asked me if I knew the guy who came to my apartment last night and was looking through the windows. I told him all about last night. He was appalled too. He said when he confronted the guy asked him if this was where Miranda lives. My neighbor was wise enough to say, "No, you have the wrong apartment." My neighbor doing this just may have saved me from that guy ever coming back. When my lease was up, I moved to a different apartment in the same community, just to be safe. I'm super grateful my friends all tried to warn me in time before it was too late. My high school does 5 and 10-year reunions. My 5-year reunion was a few years ago. My high school was on the smaller side with around 200 kids per grade, so just about everyone knew everyone, even if just partially. For the 5-year reunion, it was being held in a small banquet hall in town. I was excited to go see all my old friends who I hadn't seen in forever. Of course, arriving to these things alone can be a bit scary, so my friend Julia and I were going to go together. Julia has been my best friend ever since middle school. She knows about everything that I've been through, and I know about everything that she's been through. That includes the situation I had with a boy named Tyler. Tyler was a boy who I had a little bit of history with, meaning we hooked up a few times senior year. But he quickly started giving me crazy and obsessive vibes, and when I cut him off, he threatened me and got aggressive. He sent me threatening texts, like he knows where I live and he knows when my parents aren't home and more. One night he came to my parents' house and threw rocks at my window, and my dad had to go outside and chase him away. As time passed, I guess he lost interest in harassing me. Tyler was friends with some of the, I guess you'd say, weirder kids in high school. Not the athletes, not the cool kids, not the gothy kids, just the slightly weird group. When word got out that he'd been harassing me, a lot of people grew to hate him. I just hoped he wasn't going to be at the reunion. Julia and I got to the venue it was being hosted at and did our rounds, saying hi to a bunch of people. There was a solid 50 people there at the peak of the night, which was a solid turnout considering the small size of our grade to begin with. At some point in the night, though, I got a tap on the shoulder from none other than Tyler. When I turned to see him, I felt my heart sink. He said, "Hey, can we talk?" It had been years since I'd spoken to him, and that was the first thing he said to me. I said something along the lines of, "Hey, I hope you're good, but there's nothing to talk about," and I tried to walk away. He grabbed my shoulder and spun me around and said, "You're already going to be like that?" I pushed his hand off of me and said, "Let go of me." He looked around nervously and said, all right, and walked away. I could tell he didn't want the negative attention. This now ruined the mood of the night for me, as I had to try my hardest to avoid looking at or going anywhere near Tyler. I noticed he was with one of the kids I remember him hanging around in high school. I got into a conversation with Julia and a few other girls about the situation with Tyler, and how he just grabbed me moments ago. Everyone was on my side and agreed he'd always been a weirdo creep and was known for being aggressive with girls. Oddly enough, I didn't really see him again after I saw him with his friend. I assumed he left early, which was a major relief for me. Julia and I stayed for a few more hours. Then we left with a few other girls to go to a dive bar nearby. And then, after another hour or so, Julia dropped me off at home. As I walked up to my front door, I noticed another car pass by Julia's car and continue driving down the street. Considering the hour and how quiet the street is, that was concerning. It was a Jeep Cherokee. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe I was rightfully curious, but the next day I looked up Tyler's Instagram. He was private. I requested to follow him with my fake account, which, yes, I have for situations like this. He accepted my follow request, but I couldn't see any pictures of a Jeep, or any car for that matter. This made me feel slightly more at ease. I live alone, so my worst fear was Tyler finding my new address and coming to my house at night. The next day, Tyler DMs me on Instagram a long message, trying to manipulate me into seeing him. All these years later, he was still giving me obsessive, creepy vibes. I blocked his Instagram, but I never could have imagined what that would have led to next. The same night I blocked him, I woke up to my doorbell ringing at 1 a.m., repeatedly. I was so scared. It had to be Tyler, I just knew it. I didn't know what to do. I didn't exactly have my dad here to chase him away like all those years ago. My parents live in Florida now. The doorbell ringing turned to angry sounding pounds on the door, booming through the apartment. This pounding went on for some time, then the doorbell again, over and over and over. I finally went to the door and it stopped. I peeked out the window at the top of the door and nobody was outside. I slept with one eye open that night. And then the next day, my friend's dad helped me out and contacted his detective friend in our hometown. He came by the house and took pictures of the texts, from years ago and the long DM from just a few nights before. He then contacted Tyler and gave him a verbal warning to cease all contact or this would be considered stalking and harassment. So far it's worked. It makes me wish we went to the police all those years ago. Some people are dangerous and simply don't change. I hope he's not at the 10-year reunion. I was seeing this girl for a few weeks. We'd been on 2 dates. Her name was Phoebe. We matched on a dating app and eventually met a few days later. She was 4 years older than me. Our first date was drinks, and our second date we went out with my friends on a weekend. My friends had neutral opinions about her. They thought she was, quote, nice and kinda quiet. They'd later reveal their actual thoughts on her, but I'll get to that later. Phoebe invited me to an upcoming high school reunion party. She told me she didn't want to go alone, and honestly, after she came to hang out with my friends and I felt like I owed her. This reunion party was falling on a random Saturday in the fall. It wasn't organized by her school, though. She told me that it was organized by this rich guy from her class, and it was being hosted at his house. I haven't had my high school reunion yet, but as far as I know, these things are usually held at bars or catering halls. We got to this guy's house, and it was admittedly a fancy-looking house. It had a gated driveway, but no fancy cars parked anywhere in sight. My thought was maybe the owner parked his car in the garage during the party. The second we stepped into the house, I felt like everyone was staring at us. More specifically, me. A few people came up to Phoebe and hugged her hello, then shifted their attention to me. I felt almost like I was being interrogated with some of the questions these people were asking me. Like my whole life story, what I do for a living, who I live with. Finally, Phoebe pulled us away, only to go talk to more people who I also felt like were asking really personal and weird questions. There was also something about all the people in here. They seemed to be older looking than 28, which was the age Phoebe told me she was. Some of these people looked well into their 30s. I made a comment on that to Phoebe, and she said, yeah, some of these people aren't aging too well. I asked if she remembers all these people, and she said yes. I then asked who the party host was. I was curious to meet the owner of this big house. She said she hadn't seen him yet. Throughout the entirety of me being there, I felt like everybody was shooting me daggers. They wouldn't look away either. I whispered that to Phoebe, and she said back it's probably because they're wondering who I am. At the time, that was the only logical explanation I could think of too. It's hard to explain the growing awkwardness at this party, but I can assure you, this was not what a normal high school reunion would be like. There was no music and everyone was dressed weirdly, not like normal 28-year-olds. But that's the other thing. None of these people looked like they were in their 20s. I was getting uncomfortable with some of the stares I was getting in the room we were in, so I told Phoebe I'm gonna run to the bathroom. Realistically, I just wanted to get out of that room and explore the house a little bit. I didn't have a drink in my hand or anything to make me feel at ease. I was just walking around this giant house empty-handed, and anyone I passed stared at me. To say I felt out of place would be the understatement of the century. I found the bathroom. I stepped inside even though I didn't have to go. I locked myself inside just to sit and regather myself, take a break from the awkwardness outside. I texted all my friends about how weird this reunion was, and wondering how I could convince Phoebe to leave early. We'd already been there about 30 to 45 minutes, and this unnamed mystery party host was nowhere to be seen. Phoebe texted me, "Where are you?" I replied, "In the bathroom, give me a minute." Then I followed that up with, "This party's really weird, I'm down to leave soon." She said, "Why?" I said, "Everyone's being weird." Then someone knocked on the bathroom door, so I couldn't sit in there anymore. I washed my hands quick and left the bathroom, and the guy waiting outside, who looked like one of the younger ones here, said in a very low voice to me, "You should leave. That girl isn't who she says she is." I froze for a second, then said, "Phoebe?" He said, "Whatever she told you her name is." He then asked what she told me this party was. I said that she told me it was a high school reunion. The guy then smirked and said, "Do these people look like they're going to a high school reunion?" He left it off with, and I quote, "Trust me, leave sooner than later." And then he walked into the bathroom and shut the door. I almost knocked on the door to get him to come out and further explain, but I thought for a second. I was already suspicious and uncomfortable in this house. That guy just confirmed something weird is going on here. I walked straight to the front door without drawing attention to myself. I still felt people staring at me as I walked to the door. I walked straight from my car in the street and drove home. Phoebe texted me asking where I went. I didn't answer. When I got home, I looked up her number on White Pages. That number was not associated with the name Phoebe. The name that came up was Claire Foster. The address that I picked her up at both times is also different than the address that came up on White Pages, which made me realize I never saw her leave the house. She was already waiting on the sidewalk both times. I replied to her text, "I had to leave, I'm sorry," and blocked her number. My friends all made jokes, and they told me she thought she was weird and off from the start, but they didn't want to tell me that and make me feel bad. My one friend joked that it sounded like I was in the movie Get Out. My friends and family all have had little theories as to what was going on. Some people would even think I exaggerated the whole thing until I told them about the fake name the girl gave me, and the guy telling me to leave sooner than later.
It was my first year of university. I had just finished unpacking all of my stuff into my room, and my family had just left. Later on that same day, my roommate finally arrived, and right from the get-go, I knew this kid was the most socially inept person I'd ever met. I introduced myself as Dan, sticking out my arm for a handshake. He paused, looked down at my arm as if he didn't understand at first, then laughed and went, "Oh," and gave me an almost dead fish handshake. I had to ask him for his name since he didn't even tell me when we shook hands. He was Dale. I tried to make small talk, but he just answered my questions with yes or no's, occasionally awkwardly laughing or smiling. Within minutes, we were both just sitting on our beds, on our laptops, not talking to each other. I was upset and planned on requesting to be placed with a different roommate. Anyone would be better than Dale. I thought Dale was just a really awkward kid, but I soon learned he was much more than just that. I met some of the other kids on my floor, and they seemed cool, so that was good. I came back to my dorm after looking around campus the first night to find Dale still in the same position he was in when I left. I said, "What's up, Dale?" and he didn't answer. Not to my surprise. It was 9:30, I didn't have anything to do, so I turned out the lamp on my side of the room and went to bed. I didn't actually fall asleep anytime soon, though. Dale was on his laptop until 3 in the morning. When he finally closed his laptop, I fell asleep pretty quickly, but I woke up within the hour. The blinds to our room had been opened, and the moonlight now creeping into the room made everything visible, including Dale sitting on the side of his bed, looking at me. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and said, "Dale, what the hell are you doing?" He whispered back, "Sorry," and laid down. The next morning, I woke up to find Dale had already gotten up. I felt like it was the first time he left the room. It was a Saturday, the first Saturday of the year, meaning orientation and all the campus festivities. During the orientation, as my group was walking by the school gardens, I heard a couple of students ahead of me saying, "What is that kid doing in there?" I saw who they were talking about. It was Dale, literally sitting in the dirt behind a patch of bushes, rubbing the bark of a tree with his hand. The orientation leader didn't notice, otherwise I'm sure she would have said something. I just walked by not saying anything, eventually telling the two kids I overheard that he was my roommate as a way to start a conversation and maybe make some friends. They apologized for me. None of us really knew if it was appropriate to laugh or not, but we did. I made friends with those two kids, and we made plans to get together that night. I also learned when I got back to my dorm that the school found another roommate for me. Things seemed to be turning around quickly for the better. I left the room that night to go meet up with the two kids I met, and when I got back, Dale was sitting on the desk chair facing the door. I said, "Oh, hey, what's up?" He said nothing very matter-of-factly. I sat down on my bed and opened my laptop, and realized I forgot to lock it. I also realized that all of my emails had been opened. Emails I was pretty sure I didn't even read, and a bunch of folders of mine had been opened. Dale must have snooped through my laptop. When I asked him if he did, he responded no very loudly half a second after I even finished my question. I could read him like a book. This creepy kid was literally going through my computer when I was out. I knew he did it, but I didn't pursue it. I was ready to go to bed, so as I went into my bed to look for my pajamas, I felt like my clothing had all been moved around as well. I knew I'd be out of there forever by tomorrow, so I didn't say anything. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a zipper. I sat up and saw Dale on the ground, going through my bag. I turned the lamp on, this time confronting him about it. He played dumb, saying, "I think you have my toothbrush by mistake." It was the closest thing to wits that he'd shown up until that point. Still, I knew he was lying, and I knew something was wrong with him, so I couldn't get physical with him. The next day, I met my new roommate in the same building, and everything went well. Sunday night, after having a decent conversation with my roommate, who was no social butterfly, but was miles better than Dale, we both turned off our lights and went to bed. For the third night in a row, I woke up at some off hour of the night to a strange noise. It was a weird clicking noise. It wasn't consistent, but I'd hear it at least twice every 30 seconds. I got up, hoping to find something innocent, like a heavy bag putting pressure on a weak floorboard, or even a mouse. But as I scoped out the room, I realized the sound was actually coming from the other side of the door. The nightlight in the common area was always on, so when I looked through the peephole, I was able to see the scalp of the person standing on the other side of our door. They were looking down, so I couldn't see their face, but now that I was paying attention, I realized the tiny clicking noises were actually coming from the doorknob. I was sure the person was trying to unlock the door. I dialed the number for the campus police department, and they showed up in under 5 minutes to the common room, and only then did I feel it was safe to open the door. I found the officers to have Dale in cuffs. I had a feeling it was him. I told them everything, that he was my former roommate who was going through my stuff, so I switched dorms, only to find him trying to break into my new dorm. They took him away. I don't know what happened to him after that, but I never saw him again. He either got suspended for the semester or expelled. I got through the rest of my years at university like anybody else. However, the nightmarish experience I had with Dale still pops up in my head every now and then. I went to Binghamton University for 2 years. I quickly made a big group of friends there, and we'd go out every weekend. One weekend on a Friday night in October, when my group didn't have any big plans together, me and 2 other close friends decided to hang out in the school nature preserve by the lake. There was this little clearing on the far side of the lake that was convenient for fires. Since it was so far from view of the school or campus security, kids would sometimes, but not often, come here to smoke pot, drink, and do basically all the other drugs. It was a relatively unknown spot on campus by most, and we liked that about it. Tonight we just brought a bunch of beers, lit a fire, and hung out, having what we referred to at the time as a bro chat. As the night progressed, time seemed to pass quicker as the alcohol began to take effect. Eventually it got to the point where we were all laughing so hard that one of my 2 friends was on the floor rolling in the leaves. That was when my other friend stopped laughing and went, "Shh." We all perked up and listened, and heard the crunching of leaves and branches in the distance. We threw our bottles in the lake since we were all under 21, and it wasn't unheard of for campus police to come through the woods on weekends to catch kids doing drugs. We tucked the rest of the beers into a backpack. I was moderately drunk, so my paranoia was higher than usual. That was probably the case for all of us. The fire exposed us to anyone passing through the woods. But the thing is, this spot was so unknown and far from campus that it was rare to find anybody else that deep into the woods. It sounded like just one person in the distance. The sound of a tree branch snapping not too far away freaked all of us out. None of us were really the confrontational ones from our group, so we were lacking that one person who would have the confidence to stand up and yell out to whoever was out there. Instead, we all just sat in silence, shushing each other. We heard what seemed to be somebody or something circling us, or at least walking around in a C shape around our little campsite. It literally started to feel like we were in the movie The Blair Witch Project, because these sounds in the near distance, like cracking tree branches and leaves crunching on the ground, kept echoing over to our campsite. We laughed about it at first, but I personally soon became terrified of who or what it could be. Out of the blue, a huge thud made all three of us jump. At first I didn't understand, even though I saw what caused the sound. It took me a few seconds to digest the fact that a branch had been thrown into the center of our little fire site. One of my two friends took off running, while my other friend and I sat behind, looking at each other, half laughing, half concerned. I feel like we didn't know yet if this was some kind of joke or not. Then, my friend let out a scream of pain as he was struck in the face by another tree branch. I grabbed the backpack, helped my friend up off the floor, and we hauled ass back in the direction of our dorm. When we made it to the road separating the nature preserve from our dorm, we stopped to catch our breath. But whoever was out there proved to be following us when we heard footsteps coming closer to the road. We continued to run back to the dorm, and when we got back to our floor, we found our other friend in his room already. We looked out of his room window down to the woods. There was someone pacing back and forth by the woods, and every time a car passed, they would walk back into the woods. Eventually, whoever it was went back into the woods for good, to never be seen again by us. We continued our drinking session in the dorm room, and within 10 minutes we were all laughing about it. It wasn't until the next morning that we all realized how terrifying that experience actually was. We never really went back into the woods past dark after that. This takes place during the first week of school, my freshman year at the University of Iowa. I was just starting to get comfortable with my roommate. He was dedicated to the idea of rushing a fraternity, and rush week was starting the next week, but the parties were starting Thursday of the first week. My roommate didn't want to go alone because it would be harder to meet people that way, so he wanted me to go. I happily agreed to go with him. Even though I had no interest in rushing a fraternity, I still had intentions to go to parties. After all, I was attending a party school. My roommate wanted to go to one frat party on Thursday, and then parties at different frat houses on Friday and Saturday. On this Thursday night, we were headed to perhaps one of the lowest ranked frats. I'm pretty sure it was an underground one too. But his logic in attending was to have a backup frat in case the higher ones wouldn't give him a bid. The frat house was really far from campus in a much more slummy downtown area. We pulled up to a corner house, and if it weren't for the blasting music and cars parked everywhere, we would never picture this house as a frat house. It literally looked like they settled with the first house they found. We knocked on the door to immediately be greeted by some short, chubby guy in a white t-shirt holding a Solo cup. His shirt had sweat stains by his armpits and mid-belly area. He told us to come right in. The party itself was in a horribly dimly lit room with probably 50 guys bunched up into the living room. It was hot as hell in there to make it even worse. I think I saw maybe 2 girls at the entire party, neither of them even close to attractive. I gave the party a good 20 minutes, talking with one overweight foreigner after another, all giving off antisocial vibes. Eventually, I waved for my roommate to get ready to leave, but a huge group of guys by the door made us decide to wait a little longer to avoid the awkwardness of leaving early. I continued to drink the cheap beers they were serving. I think I downed 5 cups before I could even feel the buzz. A heavy guy approached me with a tiny bottle in his hand and handed it to me, smirking and saying, "That'll get you shit-faced." I fake laughed and thanked him, expecting him to go away, but he just watched me as if he were waiting for me to drink it. So I did. It was maybe 2 shots worth of some kind of hard liquor. The guy then started making conversation with me, and every time I hinted that I was trying to get away, he would try to pull me further into this otherwise one-sided conversation. Things started to get really blurry pretty soon. I remember feeling dizzy all of a sudden, and the room seemed to be getting darker. That was the last thing I remember before waking up in a dark room, laying in a bed. I could hear the sound of music muffled behind closed doors, so I knew I was still in the frat house. It was a very dark room, however I could still make out certain furniture in the room, and a small closet door, not much else though. But even over the blaring music, I heard the sound of a plastic bag being crunched from the closet, as if somebody had stepped on it by mistake. I ran out of that room and down the stairs back to the overcrowded living room. I found my roommate and pushed him out the front door, past the group of guys still standing in a circle right next to it. During the car ride back to campus, I told my roommate I was drugged. He almost called the cops, but I said it would be foolish and pointless. My roommate then asked me an awkward question. Was I taken advantage of? I didn't feel any type of pain, and my clothes were all still on the same, so I assumed not. When I did a time check, I realized I'd only been out for maybe 10 minutes before waking up. Whatever the guy gave me must have been a dud or something, thank God. That was my college experience of attending an underground ghetto frat party, and it remains to be my scariest life experience. I had a single dorm my first semester of sophomore year. It was in the corner of the floor, kind of secluded from the rest of the dorm rooms, since it was in its own little section. You had to turn a corner to even see the door. It was nice because I'd be able to still talk with friends on my floor, invite people over to my room, and still have privacy when it was time to do homework or go to sleep. A few weeks into the semester, while studying for a bio exam, the silence was interrupted by a noise. It took me a bit to realize it was a light tapping on the door. It was so light that I almost didn't even hear it. I yelled, "Come in," but the door didn't open, so I got up to open it. Nobody was there. I walked around the corner to look down the hall. Nobody. Somebody was obviously messing with me. I went back to my bed and continued studying, this time leaving the door open. Nobody came back. The next night, a few minutes after shutting the lamp in my bedroom to go to bed, the tapping on the door returned, only this time it was much louder, more of a knocking sound. I called out, "Who is it?" and again the knocking stopped and nobody answered. I got out of my bed quickly and opened the door to see my small private corridor was void of any people. Again, I ran the 10 feet from my door to the corner to look down the main hallway of the floor. Nobody. The next morning, I asked some of the other kids in the dorm if they had been messing with me. Everyone said no. The next night, I woke up after having been asleep for 3 hours. Someone was knocking on my door again, this time louder than ever. I had trouble deciding whether to open the door or not this time. With a bout of courage, I hopped up and opened the door. Nobody was there as I was expecting, but this time I full-on sprinted down the tiny corridor isolating my room, and when I turned the corner, I saw the back of somebody disappearing behind the far corner on the opposite side of the hallway. I ran as fast as I could down the hallway, and as I turned to the next hallway where I saw the person a few seconds earlier, I saw a door at the end of the hallway shutting. It wasn't a dorm room, it was a bathroom. I felt like I was ready to confront whoever this joker was, so I pushed open the bathroom door with force. The light was off. I turned it on expecting to see somebody hiding in there, but I didn't see anyone. My first instinct was to check the 2 bathroom stalls, which were both shut. I got on my hands and knees and looked under the 2 stalls. 2 heavy black boots could be seen from underneath one of the stall doors. I took a deep breath and pushed the stall open. I was confused. There were the boots sitting on the floor, but no person to wear them. And then I heard a creepy giggling noise. Not a feminine or childlike one. It was a kind of laughing that I could only imagine to be that of a really old crazy man. For some reason my confidence was gone and I was scared shitless. Therefore I ran back to my room and shut the door. I hopped back in my bed and started texting every friend I had. Of course everybody was asleep though. The knocking happened one more time that night. I ignored it. It went on for about 30 seconds before whoever that person was finally gave up. I spoke to everybody on my floor the next day. Nobody else heard any knocking, and everybody swore they weren't pranking me. Everybody seemed sincere. I don't know why this person chose to harass me, or who this person was. Judging by the boots and the laughing I heard, this was an older man though, and that disturbs me.
I was in my junior year of high school in 2009. I was sitting one regular school day in English class. It was towards the end of the year, and we were working on final projects, meaning we needed to use the school laptops. The school library was closed for the week because of some kind of damages or renovations. I really don't remember all the details regarding that. But even still, I was pretty sure the laptop carts were still being stored in the back room of the library. My teacher asked the class which of us would like to go down and get the cart. I really had to pee, so I raised my hand because it was a good excuse to go down to the bathroom anyway. After making a quick stop at the bathroom, I made my way to the library. The lights inside were all off. There didn't appear to be anyone in the entire library. It was pretty dark, but there was just enough light from the few windows in there to see where I was going. Like I said, the laptop carts were usually way in the back section of the library in a separate room. There was a glass window that looked from out in the main area of the library into this back room, and it was really dark in there. I tried the door handle, but it was locked. Now I looked around not knowing what to do. I didn't really want to go back to the classroom to tell my teacher. I looked around the library, hoping there was maybe at least one staff member in there. I did hear something coming from the other corner of the library, actually. As I walked closer, it sounded like some kind of consistent clicking sound. It was coming from one of the study rooms that classes would sometimes be held in. The door to this room was cracked open, but it was also dark in there. There were also windows that looked into this room, so instead of marching straight in there, I tried looking in through the window in the main section of the library. I was like 80% sure I could see someone standing in the back corner of this little room. I pushed the door open a little more and called into the room. My voice echoed a bit. I tried hitting the light switch, but the lights didn't turn on, confirming the power was shut off in the library. I stepped into the room, a bit confused why I didn't get an answer. I wanted to confirm that what I was seeing was a person. It's so hard for me to explain what I was seeing. It literally looked like a humanoid figure from the doorway. Head, torso, and everything. I didn't even have a cell phone back then to use to light up the room. I stepped deeper into this room, but I stopped when I started to become disturbed by what I was seeing. It didn't look like a person anymore. It looked like some kind of thing. Humanoid thing. I was pretty sure he or it or whatever was looking at me. I could make out a face on its head, which was easily twice the size of a normal human head. Not to mention how tall this thing was, maybe 7-8 feet up. It was completely still, as was I, and it wasn't until I saw movement in the corner that my heart completely dropped and I ran out of the room and out of the library. I was breathing heavily, heart racing. A teacher I knew named Miss Carp happened to be walking by in the hall, and I asked her frantically to follow me into the library to see. She asked me in a stern voice why I was even going into the library, given that no one was allowed to enter that week. I told her that I was sent to get the laptops, and maintaining her stern voice, she told me all the laptop carts were moved to the presentation room. Apparently, I had zoned out when my teacher mentioned this.
I told Miss Karp to follow me into the library anyway to show her what I saw. But when she reluctantly followed me there, not only was nothing there in that back room, but the light inside of that room was now working. Miss Karp was annoyed with me, and of course she didn't believe me or just thought I was seeing things. I eventually went back to class with a computer cart from the presentation room and explained to my teacher that I went to the library by mistake. I never really mentioned what I saw to anyone else for fear of sounding stupid or crazy. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or paranormal shit, but I really have no freaking clue what I could have seen in there. Sure, eyes can play tricks on you, but not like that. I saw something big in the corner of that room. Something not human. I went to a relatively small commuter college in Delaware. During my freshman year, I had my classes set up horribly. I would get to school at 3 p.m., have a couple classes, then a 2-hour gap before my next class, and I wouldn't leave campus until around 9. I'll admit, in my early years of college, I was kind of antisocial. I could have been trying to meet up with people in the food hall or joined clubs or even just went to the library during my breaks. But for my final class twice a week after my 2-hour gap, I would be in a basement classroom of one of the business halls. This basement only had this and one other classroom, and rarely ever would there be anyone else down there. Commonly, I'd just go straight down there, eat my food in the classroom, then just do homework on my laptop for the remainder of the couple hours. Or even just sit and play games on my phone or watch videos. Yeah, like I said, I was pretty antisocial. Well, one particular day, I felt lazy before class and didn't make myself food, so I had to go to the cafeteria hall to get a sandwich. I sat at a table alone and began eating, but quickly became uncomfortable after realizing I was the only one sitting alone at a table when a majority of everyone else there was sitting with friends. So I wrapped up the sandwich and decided I'd just eat down in the classroom and wait there like I usually did. I stepped out into the dark and marched back to the basement of the business hall and ate the rest of it there. Before I finished the sandwich, I heard the door creak open behind me. I was in the back corner seat right by the door, so when I turned, I was almost face to face with some kid I'd never seen before. He looked maybe a couple years older than me. He had this gross, overgrown beard, he wore glasses, he had a bit of a belly. Seriously, I'd never seen him in this class. We made awkward eye contact for a second until I looked away and continued eating. I made a mental note that the kid looked off, like he was weird or something was just not right about him. I saw in my peripheral vision the kid sit down in the desk literally right next to mine. I wanted to say so badly, why? Why are you sitting right there? But I just tried my best not to look at him and just ignore it. I looked at the time on my phone. There was still a whole hour and a half before class started. I looked up, not at the kid, but slightly looking to the left, just enough so I could see the kid looking at me. That was enough for me already. I finished my sandwich, picked up my bag, and walked out of the classroom. I didn't care where I was going. Maybe a bench outside, just not there anymore. When I stepped back outside into the darkness, I looked around for somewhere to go and sit for a while. I walked to the more woodsy section of campus and sat on a bench under a nice and bright light post. It was chilly out since it was late fall, but I'd deal with it. Not many students walked by this section of campus. It was by a pretty unused small parking lot surrounded by trees everywhere. Suddenly, I heard cracks and crunches of leaves. I looked around and spotted something. Between two pine-like bushes, there was someone standing there. I stood up and extended my neck out, I guess, to get a better look. It was that guy again. He wasn't even making an effort to hide his face. I was about to take off again when he cut through the two bushes and said hi. He started to talk to me, but the way he spoke was also off. He'd overpronounce everything, if that makes sense. He started asking me so many questions about myself, like if I go to school here, what my major is, where I work, what I do for fun. It was so painfully uncomfortable, but I tried to be nice by also asking him some questions. We ended up sitting down for a while. Eventually he asked for my number. I don't know why I gave it to him. I guess I was trying to be nice. Then he turned it weirder. He asked where I live. At first I answered with my hometown, but he said no, like, where do you live? I paused, not knowing what to say. I repeated my same answer. Then he said, no, like, what's your address? I didn't even ask him why he was asking that. I just said I gotta go and quickly walked away. When I looked back, the guy was following me. I didn't know what was wrong with him, but he was freaking me out. I skipped class that night and drove straight home. I crashed into bed and started doing my homework. After finishing a short paper, I checked my phone and it was full of texts from some random fake number. There had to be like 20 texts. They were all from that kid. It started with hey, then he worked down to you have a nice house. I suddenly felt a pain in my chest area. I replied back, go away or I'm calling the police. Then there was a knock at my window. I had the shade down, I couldn't see who it was. But along with the knock, I heard a muffled but familiar voice say, open the window. I yelled on calling the cops. Then he went silent. My mom and dad weren't home, so I really did end up calling the police. Nothing else happened before the police came. I showed them the texts and explained the whole story. They said, though, that it would be better to see if it continued, since the kid didn't actually make any threats yet. They left, saying call again if he came back to the house and to block his number. The next day, the college sent a text to all students' phones warning about sightings of a dangerous young man seen walking around with a knife. Classes were shut down for the day, and police searched the entire campus. I called to give my story and was asked to give it to the police again. As far as I know, that creepy guy was never caught. I don't know why he was targeting me, I don't know what his motive was, but this is the story about how I was almost murdered in my own home by someone I met at school. Back in high school, my group of friends consisted of about 10 people, but it would be rare that we'd all do things together. On a dark and cloudy school day, my friends Jared, Michelle, Christina, and I were all sitting in history together. We had a sub that day, and we weren't really doing any work, so everyone was just talking. Our high school was really old, like built in the 1930s, and there sat an old second building in the woods that was apparently used back in the 40s as some kind of daycare or preschool, and it just happened to be on the high school grounds, but they never tore it down. It was so old and decrepit it has vines growing on the side walls of it. The four of us were talking about how we should break into it that night since it was Friday. We didn't tell the rest of our friends because it would be harder to do with a lot of people. So nightfall came. We snuck onto the school grounds through a more hidden path to avoid security, and we easily made it towards the woods. We got to the building, which was in a fenced-off area. Jared and I boosted the girls up over the fence. Then we climbed over ourselves. The building was about twice the size of a house. There was no way we were the first ones to have been doing this. We scanned all four walls looking for a good entry point. There were multiple windows, and then we found the front door to the building. Locked, of course. Jared and I ended up breaking a window, but we had the girls keep watch. Once again, we boosted the girls up inside first, then Jared crawled inside, and lastly me. It took me a bit to squeeze in. I was the biggest one there after all. I actually cut my hands on some glass. After managing to get in, I looked around in the dark, cold room I was standing in. I realized it looked like an archaic, class-like room, but I also realized my friends weren't in there. I yelled Jared's name over and over. I left the little class-like room and entered a tight, decrepit hallway. There were a bunch of open doors leading to similar classrooms, but now I was more focused on finding my friends. I had no idea why they went ahead of me so quickly. I called their names again and again to no avail. I looked into all the tiny classrooms until I got to one, where I saw Jared standing in the corner. He was looking out the window. I said, "Dude, what the hell are you doing, and why couldn't you wait for me?" He just turned and looked at me, I guess. I couldn't make eye contact in that darkness. I looked down the hall again and called both girls' names. And with that, I heard someone stepping on something pretty loudly further down the narrow hall. I stepped through the mess of random school objects littered on the floor and got to the last classroom on the left. And the second I looked inside, someone jumped out and screamed in my face. I nearly had a heart attack, but it was Jared. Christina and Michelle came out from behind me, hysterically laughing. They revealed that they came up with a plan to hide from me to scare me a few minutes before going in. I playfully shoved Jared, but with my heart still racing from the scare, it started racing even faster because I remembered that figure I just saw in that other classroom. I told them all to shh and whispered I saw someone else and thought it was Jared. I waved for them to follow me back to that classroom, but whoever that person was in the corner wasn't there anymore. I stepped into the classroom, but it looked empty. Then I heard one of the girls gasp. I stepped back to them and looked at what the three of them were looking at. She was pointing at the crack between the door to the classroom. There was someone standing behind the door with their face pressed up between the crack to the door. The two girls screamed, and Jared yelled, "Let's get out of here." We all ran back to the window we came in through. I was the last one to climb out, and I can't tell you how scared I was that I was going to be grabbed by the legs and pulled down as I was climbing through. But I made it out. We hopped the fence again and ran back to Christina's house. It didn't make sense. The door to the building was locked, and the window we smashed was the only open window. So how could that man have gotten in? Better question, what was he doing in there? We told the rest of our friends, and rumors quickly spread about the building. I'm sure others went in there after that, but we never went near that building again.
This is something you guys have been requesting the hell out of for a long time. It took a lot of time, but I finally found 3 stories that take place during school lockdowns. It was a typical boring day in calculus, only it was Friday, 7th period, meaning the week was almost over and spring break would finally be upon us, so everybody was getting antsy in their seats, I could tell. We didn't have a test that day like a lot of my friends did with their other teachers, so our teacher in the middle of class just decided to start playing games with us on Sporcle.com. He was a very laid-back teacher like that. As we were doing some brand logo quiz on Sporcle, I remember the exact moment it happened. Right after my friend answered a question, I remember the exact answer too, Adidas. The dean's voice came through the loudspeaker. He sounded panicked and frantic as he told all the teachers this was not a drill and to go into lockdown. I actually got the chills and I got goosebumps on my arms as our usually laid-back teacher too seemed panicked as he ran to turn off the lights and ushered us to the back corner of the room. We all sat in silence for about 2 minutes, and then the usual buzzing that came from a panel in the back of the room ceased, indicating that the school must have cut all the power. We all looked at each other, realizing this must be serious. A few more minutes of waiting later, we heard a man screaming at the top of his lungs coming down the hallway. 2 girls in the class actually started crying, which made all of us even more scared. As the screaming got closer to the classroom, the lunatic-sounding man started banging on the lockers while screaming, "I'll kill all of you." It was at that moment that I started to fear for my life. My teacher shushed us as we all looked at each other to see our peers' reactions. The banging then moved from the lockers to our classroom door. And that's when one of the crying girls screamed no. The banging on the door only grew worse as the man started screaming, "Open up." 2 of the girls in the class were crying out loud now. It felt like an eternity that man was pounding at the door. But eventually, he finally continued down the hallway, screaming like a mentally insane person until we could not hear him anymore. I'd say 10 minutes later, though it felt like half an hour given the situation, the dean came back on the loudspeaker explaining the situation, which was surprising for him to do.
He explained that some apparently mentally unstable person entered the building and assaulted the woman sitting at the front desk, causing her to flee the building screaming, and staff wasn't sure if the man was armed or not. Now, this was before the school had cameras or could afford proper security, so the school was wide open to something like this happening. The staff had done a sweep of all the hallways and classrooms and couldn't find him, so the dean instructed the teachers to resume teaching but to keep all the doors locked and to not let any students leave for any reasons. The most disturbing part, however, is that one of the janitors working the night shift found the man sleeping in one of the storage closets near the back end of the school, and according to rumors that were spread by my peers, sticking out of his pocket was a .44 Magnum. The janitor must have done something stupid to wake him up, for example, leaving the closet door open, because by the time a police officer could arrive on the scene, the man was gone. My entire class, as far as I know, to this day, has no idea if this man was ever found, but I like to think that right now, he's being given the proper help that he needs. My school has 2 lunch periods. First lunch period is for all 6th graders and some 7th graders. The second lunch period is for the other half of the 7th graders and all 8th graders. The lockdown happened in the beginning of October. The day the lockdown occurred, it was overcast and rainy. During the first lunch period, I heard 4 loud booms. I personally thought it was thunder, but the entire lunch crowd started screaming. I was thinking those kids were just serious pussies, but the campus security came in and started yelling at people to go into the multi-purpose room, and the kids who were in line buying lunch had to throw out their lunch and come inside. Me and some friends went inside the room along with a huge group of other kids. Everyone was curious as to what was happening. Our multi-purpose room is huge, and the back wall of the room is made of see-through glass. When me and my friends were rushed inside the campus, security was covering the glass with the curtains, and there were adults at every exit. My friend Eric was curious, as well as the rest of us, so he asked one of the adults what was going on. When he came back, he said, "You know how right in front of TMS there's those houses?" I replied, "Yeah." "There's this mentally disabled, crazy man that barricaded himself in front of his house, and he's threatening to commit suicide and kill the cops if he's evicted. He was walking around outside of school watching kids in a weird way," Eric told us. It turned out the man was also a registered sex offender, making matters worse. We were stuck in the multi-purpose room for a whole hour, taking up 2 periods. After the whole thing was settled, we were escorted to our classrooms one by one. I later found out that the man lives next to my friend Brandy, who told me about the previous Halloween when she saw the same man at his window cutting his arm and writing in his own blood, "Don't come here or I'll kill you," on his window. Of course, being Halloween, people, including Brandy, assumed it was just for the holiday. But after this horrific incident, we knew this man was mental, and we're glad he never got near us. I'm 22 years old, fresh out of college, and I recently got a job at my old high school as a sort of computer intern in the school basement. The basement of the school is very messy and disorganized, but there is a small 3-person office that's actually very nice down there. It has 3 nice big desks, 2 mini fridges, a flat screen TV mounted on the wall, and oh so satisfying air conditioning, a luxury the students and teachers cannot enjoy in the school. And of course all the school servers and other computery stuff. I got the job because 3 of my old computer teachers flat out adored me. I could actually consider them as real friends, not just teacher figures, so they all helped tremendously in landing me this job. It's been great, until something that happened a few weeks ago. My 2 co-workers that shared the office with me, Dave and Gary, weren't in the office at the time. They were upstairs working on papers or whatever. I was eating my sandwich during my lunch break when I got a phone call from one of the women in the front office telling me the school was on lockdown and that somebody, possibly armed, had entered the school. There wasn't much that I could do other than turn off the lights because, surprisingly, as nice as this little office was, it didn't have an actual door to it, just a big opening, and the door to the whole basement didn't even have a working lock. For my own safety, I did turn off all the lights in the office and my computer screen. I kept my phone on the desk, texting both Gary and Dave, but they wouldn't respond. I sat down there in the dark, playing games on my phone for like 20 minutes, waiting for the call from up front to tell me to resume working. I had no idea what was happening. I couldn't hear what was going on upstairs from down here, but I was not allowed to make any calls until I was informed that the lockdown was over. Then the noisy basement door opened. As the creaking echoed across the basement and into my office, I sat up from my seat, wondering if I should call out Gary or Dave. I was eager to get some info from them. Someone then came running down the stairs, and their footsteps were approaching my office. I pushed away my chair and crawled under my desk. Somebody entered the office but did not turn on the lights. There was just silence. I can't even describe the fear I was experiencing. I felt like if I made one sudden noise, I'd be a dead man. Suddenly, my phone dinged as I got a text message. I felt my entire world shrivel up and die at that one moment as I clenched my teeth in fear. Footsteps suddenly moved closer to me until I finally dove out from under the desk in capitulation, begging whoever it was not to kill me. And just then, someone grabbed my arm and pulled me up. It was some guy in a red plaid button-up, jeans, and a reddish-black cap. He told me, "It's okay, I'm just down here hiding with you." "What's going on up there?" I whispered to him. He kind of ignored my question and asked me if there's an exit down here. I told him, "Yeah, around that way." Before he could do anything else, I asked him, "Who are you?" There was a brief moment of silence before he started explaining he was coming in to pick up his son when a teacher told him to hide. After his explanation, I checked my phone and saw the text I received was from Dave. It said, "Dude, this is fucking crazy. Some guy with a gun shot Mr. Buckley. He's wearing a red shirt and a hat. Whatever you do, don't come upstairs." I was about to reread that text out loud to the man until I realized. I looked up and felt my stomach sink. The man seemed to catch on to my suspicious stare. Panicking, all I could think to do was to run for the upstairs. A gunshot echoed through the basement and I could hear the bullet ricochet off something metal in the darkness. But thank God the bullet missed me and I made it upstairs. Fortunately, police were waiting at all exits, including the basement exit, and caught the man the second he opened the door. More good news, our teacher Mr. Buckley survived the gunshot. It was later determined that the man and Mr. Buckley had some beef for whatever reason, but that was never revealed. All we know is that Mr. Buckley couldn't have done anything that would have warranted this kind of reaction. And I know that the sound of that gunshot will forever echo in my mind.
I was a senior when this happened. Senioritis had fully kicked in. It was football season. Our high school was always big on football games because our football team was actually good, and there's nothing else to do in our boring country-ass town. One day at school, we were in some joke of an elective. My friend JJ was in this class with me, so we'd always mess around. It was a Friday, and there was a football game later that day, so we planned to go. And JJ, being the sweet talker he's always been, spun his chair around to face these girls Kayla and Ashley and asked them to go to the football game with us. We already knew them well, so it wasn't weird of him to invite them or anything. They seemed down to meet us later, so JJ dropped me off at home after school, and like 4 hours later, he picked me up, and then we picked up Kayla and Ashley. Then we drove to the school back parking lot by the woods. We had some Four Locos in the car, making sure nobody was passing by. Then we poured some more into water bottles to bring to the bleachers with us. We walked over to make sure we got good seats at the top row of the bleachers. Since the game started late, it started getting dark during the third quarter, and by the fourth quarter it was dark. Our team was losing pretty bad for a change this game. So bad even that a lot of the kids in the bleachers were leaving early. We just stayed, planning on hanging out on the field after anyway. The game ended and our team lost really bad, and so the field and bleachers were quiet. People were scurrying off the bleachers. The team rushed back inside the locker room in embarrassment, and the away team slowly made their way back to the buses. Within 10 minutes, we were among the only people left in the bleachers, minus a couple others and maybe a couple people in the field. We were honestly drunk by this point, and the team's defeat wasn't ruining our fun. When the field lights turned off, it was basically pitch black here minus the moonlight. Everyone was gone. We went to go lay in the field. JJ ran to his car to get more alcohol. By now, it was probably 10 o'clock. JJ said let's go in the woods next to the football field. The girls of course were scared, and that's why the idea seemed fun. When they wouldn't budge, we both got up and ran towards the woods, leaving them alone in the dark, knowing they'd get scared and follow us, which they did. We crawled under the little ripped chunk of fence that kids would use to get into the woods, and then started walking down the little hill into the woods. The girls were very reluctant to follow, but they did. We ran ahead to lose them and hide just to mess with them. As soon as they heard us running, they both yelled to stop. They tried to keep up, but we lost them and hid behind a couple trees. We hid and laughed for a few seconds. Then JJ patted me and told me to look in that direction. And though it was dark, we could see, perhaps only because of the moonlight barely finding its way through the trees, a towering black figure, maybe 15 feet away from us, standing between two trees. It was a horrifying sight. Then they spoke. It was a woman's voice, and she said, "You kids shouldn't be in here." We just stood there and looked in silence at the figure of the apparent woman. But we both noticed she seemed to be getting bigger and closer very quickly, yet we didn't see the legs moving, or what we assumed were legs. And we heard no footstep sounds. JJ and I turned and ran. We ran and called the girls' names until we found them. Then they followed us out of the woods. We told them to just follow us to the car and run. At the car, we finally told them that some 7-foot-tall woman was in the woods. JJ said that if I hadn't seen it as well, he would have thought that he saw an apparition. The girls were freaked out, asking us to tell them that we were kidding, but we weren't. We watched from the car to see if anyone came out of the woods. No one ever did. The biggest question is, why would an older woman be in there at night alone? It's not like it was a nature trail, it was a fenced-off wooded area. Our school didn't have security back then either, so it wasn't that. The four of us went to go hang out at JJ's after, and I'll leave the rest of that night to your imagination. Now we're really fast-forwarding to that summer, when I was working at the school one final time as a summertime custodian, since I got a raise every summer that I'd return. There were about 4 of us in the building, 2 older custodians, and myself and another 18-year-old. I was in the center courtyard of the school mowing the grass when I spotted someone at an upstairs window. It was an older woman. She looked like 65 maybe from the distance, with short curly hair, but her face was kind of blurred behind the glare of the window. I stopped mowing, looked at her, and waved. She didn't wave back. She didn't even move. I basically ran inside to where my boss was and asked who that woman upstairs was. He asked who. I told him to follow me. She was in one of the math classrooms. I led him to the upstairs math hallway. But to my surprise, all the classroom doors were closed and the lights were all off. The classroom it looked like she was in was empty. My boss told me there was no one else in the building and that I need to drink some coffee. He went back downstairs, so I did the same. I was genuinely freaked out. After I finished mowing, I started mopping the upstairs hallways and classrooms. Eventually, I was in the math hallway, and I would be mopping every last classroom floor up there, so I opened all the doors and turned on all the lights. I had my radio on the floor playing music as usual. Over the music, I heard a distinct woman's voice. It said, "Young man." It came from one of the classrooms. I couldn't tell which, but I turned off the music and started checking every nearby classroom, desperately hoping to find someone. Every single classroom was empty. I even checked behind the desks. The hairs on my arms were standing up. I felt a fight or flight response kick in. I bailed to the downstairs and told my boss once again someone's up there. I heard a voice now. He once again went up there with me, and I explained that I couldn't find anyone, but I saw and now heard a woman up here. When we didn't find anyone again, He told me to go home and take the day off and get some sleep. He thought I was crazy. I then put the two incidents together. What if they were connected? What if what JJ and I saw in the woods and what I saw and heard in that classroom are somehow related? When I came back to work the next day, I told my boss I just didn't want to work in the math hallway because I was freaked out. For the rest of the summer, I didn't go in that hallway again. Ever since then, I full-heartedly believe that my old high school is haunted by some spirit of an older woman. I have no other explanations. This happened when I was 15, a sophomore in high school. Unfortunately, lunch classes were randomized, so this year I only had my friends Liam and Mike in that lunch period with me. A few months into the school year, one day this new kid walked in first period astronomy. Our teacher, who was a jokester, made him introduce himself to the class. His name was Craig. He teased Craig for a minute, then asked him to sit down. I sat in the back row, and the only open desk was next to me in the back corner. Craig came over and sat next to me. Class didn't technically start yet, so everyone was still chatting. As Craig sat down, he looked around the room, then I felt his stare shift to me. I turned and we made eye contact, and he nodded his head and said, "What's up?" I said, "Hey man, what's up?" He introduced himself, so I gave him my name as well. Craig was a white kid with very patchy, pubish-looking facial hair. He wasn't attractive, but he wasn't butt ugly. He just looked like a somewhat average guy. He was making small talk with me, and I was being nice because I could imagine how rough the first day at a new high school could be. I was probably the first person he officially met in the school. That period, we had to get into pairs for an assignment, so obviously Craig asked me to work with him. I had to say yes, why not? I didn't have any close friends in this class anyway. We had the laptop cart this period to begin work on the assignment, so we all had laptops. I could tell pretty quickly I didn't like Craig's sense of humor. He joked too much and was acting like we were good friends, but his jokes weren't normal, and he'd have this cringy laugh every time he made a joke. He cursed every other word, and he'd make constant dirty and vulgar jokes. I was no softy when it came to that, but it was just too much with him. By the end of the period, we had to exchange numbers for the project. Then it was on to my next class. Eventually came lunchtime. Mike didn't come to school for that day, so it was only Liam and I at our little circular lunch table. Suddenly I see Liam's eyes look up at someone behind me. Then someone pulls up a chair next to me, and I look and see Craig. He pats my shoulder and says, "What's up, buddy?" I kind of died a little inside. This meant he'd be sitting here every day now. I tried to be positive and give him a chance. Maybe he wasn't that bad. Liam tried being nice at first, but eventually, Craig started saying weird shit again, and Liam caught on that something was off, and he kept shooting me these knowing faces when Craig wasn't looking. That lunch period cemented the fact that something was off about Craig. I'm not judging anyone for being antisocial, but something about him seemed dark, like the awful things he'd say. It went beyond an antisocial personality. After school that day, since it was a Friday, I walked home and started texting my group chat about what we'd be doing later. On my walk home, I got a text from an unsaved number, and when I opened it, I realized it was Craig. He said, "Turn around." I did, and saw Craig running down the sidewalk towards me, waving. "Oh God," I said under my breath. I waited for him. When he caught up to me, he asked how far I lived from school. I said about a 10-minute walk, and he said same, and he said he'd walk with me. Then he asked if I wanted to work on the assignment real quick and bang it out over some beers. I told him I was actually going to be busy with my friends. He asked what I'd be doing. Uh-oh, he was trying to invite himself. I said we'd just be chilling at Liam's house, and he actually asked if it was cool he came. I didn't even know what to say. I came up with some BS, like Liam's mom doesn't let strangers in right away. It seemed to work. Craig kept walking with me, and I started wondering, is he following me all the way home? That's what he did. I got to my house and said, "Alright man, see you later," and gave him a little fist bump. He said see you later, and kept walking down the street. I noticed him look back, so I looked away. I texted my group chat about how weird he is, and Liam backed up what I was saying. We went about making plans to hang out at Liam's house for real, but not until like 9 o'clock. After an hour or two later, Craig texted me something disturbing. He said, "Yo, what's going on in front of your house? Why is there a cop car?" I replied, "What do you mean?" I rushed to go outside to the front stoop. There were no cop cars. It was just Craig standing in our driveway. He was laughing, and like a complete weirdo, he laughed and said, "I got you." Then he said, "I thought you were going to your friend Liam's place." I said, "Yeah, in a little bit." Then I said, "Why are you being weird?" He didn't laugh at that. I saw he was visibly offended. I said I gotta go inside, and so I did and shut the door. He texted me all offended saying, "Bro, WTF." I was speechless. I just met this kid today. I spent 40 minutes with him. Why was he obsessing over me and following me and now stalking me? He literally tricked me into coming outside to see if I was home. I texted him back, "You're freaking me out, bro." I guess that was a mistake. He sent me some long message about how he thought I seemed chill and was different from the rest, but how I'm just like everyone else. I sent a screenshot to my friend group, and they were all laughing and shocked at the same time. I emailed my teacher and asked him if I could do the assignment myself and explain the situation. Then I left my house and walked to Liam's house just to get out. While I was at Liam's, Craig tried calling me. I just let it ring and ignored it. It was going to be an awkward day of class come Monday morning. Skipping ahead to when I got home around 11 or 12, my parents and sister were out. My parents might have been out with friends, and my sister may have been with her boyfriend, nothing unusual. I locked the door behind me and went up to my room. I started watching YouTube videos, and I heard the back door ring. Yes, our house has a back doorbell. It had a different ring than the front doorbell. I hopped up and went downstairs, expecting to see my sister at the back door. But the lights in the backyard were off, and no one was on the other side of the door. I could see through the glass. I opened the main door, with the screen door still locked. I said hello, and I 100% heard the sound of someone's shoe scraping the concrete patio, just to the left, out of view from the door. I shut the door again and relocked it, and went back upstairs to call my dad, who didn't pick up. But just then, my phone started ringing again. It was Craig. I didn't pick up. He then texted me saying, "Come outside, shitbag." I replied, "I'm calling the police." And to my surprise, he replied, okay, I'm leaving." It was him. He was hiding in the yard, waiting for me to come out. I sent the screenshot to my family and friends, and then to the school, who would reach out to his parents. Apparently, this was the exact reason the troubled family had to keep moving, because he would keep causing issues with people at every school he went to. I can only imagine the horrible things he's done to other people who didn't want to be his friend. He didn't show up to class on Monday, or ever again. If I had to guess, I think he once again transferred schools. I live in rural New Brunswick. It was early September and it was my first day of school. I unfortunately was held back my senior year, so I'd be returning as a 19-year-old. I live in a rural area, so the middle school and high school was the same building, which also meant I knew most of the kids since it was a smaller school. When I got to school, I had study hall period A, which was the first period of the day. However, I noticed a new kid that I never met before on the other side of the room. I walked over to him and introduced myself. He introduced himself to me as Chester, and that he just moved here. I showed him around the school and showed him where his next class is. As I was giving him a tour of the school, I noticed he seemed a bit off. As I was showing him around, he began to ask me questions. At first they seemed normal, like how long I've been at the school or where our classroom was, but then he asked me some questions that seemed more strange. One question he asked stood out the most. He asked for my address and snap. I was completely thrown off by this because I found it off to ask that. I ended up not giving him my address, but I thought why not to give him my snap. I gave him it and went on with my day. When the last period of the day came, I had English class. When I got to it, I noticed that there were only about 9 kids in the class. I was in the lowest level English class, so I wasn't expecting a lot of kids to be in my class. I took my seat, and that's when I looked 120 degrees behind me and saw that Chester kid eating a disgusting sandwich. He stared at me from the opposite side of the room and gestured for me to walk over to him. My English teacher, Mr. Bass, was about to start class, so I ignored his bullshit and went on with the class. 5 minutes later, I looked up from my book, and I noticed Chester again staring at me. This time he was more pissed off looking. Again, he gestured for me to walk over to him, and again, I continued reading my book. Then my phone pinged. It was a Snapchat message from Chester. He said, "Follow me." I replied, "I can't, we're in the middle of class." Next, I saw him get up from his table and ask Mr. Bass if he could go to the bathroom. He then walked out into the hall. I wanted to see why he wanted me to follow him, so 5 minutes later, I asked Mr. Bass if I could go to the bathroom as well. I then walked out into the hall. I didn't know where he went, so I looked down each hallway, and eventually I saw him. He was walking really slowly about 50 feet away. I stayed at a distance behind him so that he wouldn't know I was there. He then turned down a hallway in the school that wasn't really used for classes and was more for storage, bathrooms, and offices. I then saw him open a door. He walked inside and shut the door behind him. I walked over to the door he walked in and recognized it to be the door that led to the school's basement. There was no way in hell I was going down there. I just casually went back to my class. When I got back, my phone pinged. It was him again. First, he sent me a message saying, "Why didn't you enter the basement?" He then sent a picture of him eating a disgusting sandwich in the basement. He sent one more chat asking me to walk down into the basement. By now, I was getting creeped out by the kid, so I replied asking him to leave me alone. I then removed and blocked him. When I got home, I immediately started on my homework. By the time I was done, it was about 11 p.m., and I was home alone. I was putting all of my homework away. Just then, my phone received a notification from Snapchat. Someone added me as a friend. It was from an account called "Why Didn't You Enter the Basement?" It was him, so I blocked it. Then a couple minutes later, I got another request. This time the account was called "Why'd You Block Me?" I blocked that one, and then another one came. This one was even more ominous. It was called "I Know Where You Live," followed by "I'm right outside your house." And just then, I heard a window break downstairs. I immediately called the cops and told them what was happening, and the operator said find a safe place to hide and lock the door. I then hung up and went into the hallway closet. I heard footsteps move from downstairs to upstairs. I cracked open the closet door and I saw him. At the end of the hallway in the dark, I saw Chester. It didn't seem like he knew that I noticed him until he turned his head to look at the closet, but it didn't seem like he knew I was inside. I didn't close the door, but I hid deeper in the closet. Chester then went over and opened the door. I was hiding behind a large container while he struggled to find the light. He eventually gave up and I heard his footsteps fade away downstairs. Seconds later, the police knocked on the door. I immediately opened it and told them what happened, but by the time they arrived, Chester was gone and there was nobody on my property. They found out that he escaped through a window in my basement. I gave the police the accounts and they said they'll do their best to trace them. The very next day of school, I went to the principal to report Chester. But the creepiest thing was what he told me. My principal said that there was nobody in the whole school named Chester. There were no records of him ever having been a student. I got chills. The camera footage was checked, and it turned out that he snuck in through a back entrance of the school and blended in with the other kids. I never saw him again at school, and I never heard from the police. But to this day, I still think about why he wanted me to go into the school basement. All I can say is that was probably the most dangerous person I'd ever met. And I don't know what his intentions were. This was something that happened so long ago that a lot of details are a little blurry. It's not like it happened yesterday. I'll try my best to fill in smaller details that I don't fully remember with how I best remember things played out. It was the last day of school. I was in the 4th grade. 4th grade was the last year in our elementary school where kids had to be picked up by their parents. 5th graders were allowed to walk home on their own. My mom would always be the one to pick me up. On the last day of school, my friend Dennis and I had a playdate planned to celebrate the last day of school. Dennis wasn't in my class this year, but we had been friends since kindergarten. He was in a different dismissal hallway from me. After school was over, we single file lined up and walked to the exit door at the end of the hall, where we waited outside by our teacher, Miss Blue. I waited for Dennis's dad to appear from the crowd of parents shuffling in and out of the parking lot next to the doors. Then I heard my name. "Tommy, Tommy." I look over and see a man waving at me as he approached. He introduced himself as Dennis's uncle and said he was picking me up. I went over to Miss Blue and said I'm being picked up. She asked, "Where is he, sweetie?" And I pointed to Dennis's uncle who waved at Miss Blue. Miss Blue dismissed me and I went with the man. He led us through the crowd and was a very quick and jittery talker, like he spoke fast and had a bit of a stutter. He was walking incredibly fast. It was almost hard to keep up with him with my backpack on. He explained to me that his brother, or Dennis's dad, was working later than expected, so he was driving me back. We got to his car, which was a dark red hatchback type car from what I remember, and it took me this long to acknowledge the giant elephant in the room. Where was Dennis? Why weren't we picking him up too? The man turned to look at me in the back seat and said that Dennis was already at his house. I was shy around people I didn't know, especially adults, and I wasn't one to openly speak my mind if I was confused. But I was very confused. This was making less and less sense. The whole drive, the man kept yapping, telling stories of his days in elementary, asking me questions like what sports I played, what we're learning in class. If I had to guess, we were in the car for like 10 minutes, which honestly for our town where houses were right on top of each other, that was a while. My house was a 5-minute walk away from the school. We were definitely in an area I wasn't familiar with when he parked the car in front of his house. His house looked pretty normal to me from what I remember. He led us inside and shut the door and locked it behind us. It was really, really dark inside the place, and I realized why. All the curtains were shut. It almost felt like it was nighttime in there, especially because the only source of light was a dim lamp in the corner of the room. He then looked at me and smiled. I said, "Where's Dennis?" And he started acting really jittery and nervous seeming. He said something like, "Oh, I think he's downstairs playing video games. Give me a second. Wait here." He then disappeared into a nearby room, and I heard a door open and then footsteps descending into a basement. I know my heart was already racing. I knew I was in danger. I went to the door to quietly try to open it, but I couldn't. It had some kind of lock that must have needed a key for. I really started to panic now, yet I still probably held out a little bit of hope that Dennis would be coming up those stairs, but I knew the chances of that were slim. I regretted entering that house. I did the only thing I could think to do. I went to the kitchen and found a phone hung on the wall. I picked it off the receiver and dialed 911. The first thing I said when they answered was in a whisper, "Please come to this house. I've been kidnapped." They heard me, they acknowledged me, but I didn't say another word. I hid the phone under a towel in the corner of the room with 911 still on the line. I hurried back to where the man left me as I already heard his footsteps coming back upstairs. Then he called my name, saying, "Come down, Dennis is down here." Then there was a pause. He repeated my name, and when I didn't answer, he came up the stairs fully to look at me. He asked me if I was okay. I felt so sick, and I was so scared. I hated myself for walking into this situation and not being wiser. I asked in a very scared voice if I could leave, and I remember the change in his face. His fake, friendly smile disappeared as he realized that I was no longer falling for this. He walked closer to me in a gentle manner, until he was close enough to grab my wrist aggressively, and he started pulling me towards the basement. I screamed and cried, and he screamed at me, "I'll let you go if you stop and behave." So I listened. I went down the stairs, and halfway down, the door slammed shut behind me, and I heard it lock. I walked fully down the stairs to this empty, unfinished basement with a concrete floor and one singular support beam in the middle of the room. There was a depressing yellow glow in the room from one exposed light bulb hanging on the ceiling. If there was a place you'd imagine kidnapped children to go, this would be it. I heard his heavy footsteps upstairs. You could hear everything in this house. I don't know what he was doing, but I heard him walking around for a while. Then he came to the basement door, opened it, and he called down asking if I'm hungry. I replied no. I didn't want him going into the kitchen seeing the missing phone. He shut the door and locked it again. I sat down there, waiting, with my heart in my throat, and then I heard it. The doorbell ringing 3 times from upstairs, followed by banging sounds, which were definitely the sounds of police banging on the door. I would refrain from screaming until I heard the front door open, but I never heard the man's footsteps approach the door. The doorbell kept ringing, and I kept hearing the bangs. This went on for some time, until I heard a really loud bang sound, and then multiple heavy footsteps and multiple screaming voices. I started screaming for help as loud as I could at the top of the stairs, banging on the door. The door was unlocked, and a police officer on the other side grabbed hold of me and hurried me outside. There were at least 3 cop cars outside. I had to tell everything to 2 of the cops outside as we waited for my parents to show up. The man from inside was brought outside and into a cop car in handcuffs, and that was the last time I ever saw him. When my parents arrived on the scene, my mom was bawling her eyes out. There had already been a whole scene at the school as cops were called and Dennis's dad realized what happened. This man was a work associate of Dennis's father. When he somehow learned that Dennis's dad would be picking up Dennis and I from school on the last day, he seized the opportunity to do what he did. A complete sick fuck. I don't know how he found out what I looked like. As I got older, I never really asked for more details because I try not to think about it. My mom went to counseling with me for months after this incident. Let's just say my parents didn't have kind words for Miss Blue, not verifying if I actually knew the person picking me up. If I didn't think to call the police before he basically threw me in that basement, I know for a fact I'd be dead right now. This was like 17 years ago. That man might be out of prison for all I know. It was junior year of high school, and it was the last day of school. A lot of people cut school this day or left early after lunch period. My friends and I were some of the latter. It was a stormy, dark day. A bunch of people from our grade originally planned to hit the beach on the last day of school, but that was obviously canceled. So my smaller core group of friends decided to do something else. There used to be an abandoned elementary school in town that hadn't been used for like 10 years. There were plans to tear it down by the year's end. So, still wanting to do something fun on the last day of school, we all agreed to break into the building and just fuck around exploring. There were no cameras in that old building, and on a stormy day, no one would be outside monitoring the place or anything, so we all left after lunch period. Our friend Eddie already had a car and his license, so he drove us all to the abandoned school. The school was in the middle of a neighborhood, not on any main roads or anything. There was a back parking lot covered by overgrown bushes and trees on one side, and the walls of the school on two other sides. It was a perfect spot to park and go unnoticed. The place wasn't boarded up or anything, it was just locked up. Eddie had a baseball bat in his trunk that he took out to smash one of the windows of the school. I was honestly so nervous that even through the pouring rain, one of the houses over the fence would hear the smashing sound. We all watched and nervously laughed as Eddie swung the bat into the window in front of the car, and after a few good swings, smashing it. He pushed away the stray pieces of glass stuck to the frame with the bat, and then he waved us over. We one by one climbed through the window into the school. My logic was that the school was being torn down anyway. What does a broken window matter? We all were inside the building now. The window we climbed through was actually one of the windows for a classroom. A lot of stuff was still left in the room, including the desks and some decorations on the walls. Based on the decorations, it looked like we were in a 4th or 5th grade classroom. It was very surreal to be inside of what was once an active classroom where little kids would come to learn. Now nothing but a cold, dark, and abandoned room collecting dust waiting to be destroyed. The sounds of thunder and lightning outside also added to the surreal feeling of it all. There were no lights on in the building. Power to the place was likely cut completely. We anticipated this though. The flashlights on our phones were plenty to get around and see. Even without them, it wasn't completely pitch black in there, as even though it was a dark day, some light was still creeping in through the windows and doors. We started traversing the hallways, going from room to room. Each classroom was still full of desks and chairs that hadn't been sat in probably a decade. We all four were in the same classroom, when there was a sound that echoed down the hallway and into the classroom. We all went silent and turned off our lights for a moment. After a flash of lightning, we slowly accepted that it was probably nothing, so we continued on. We just went from room to room as our wet shoes all squeaked on the floors. Sneaking around wasn't possible, really. A lot of things in the school were visibly decaying. You could really tell no one had stepped foot in there in ages. As we neared the corner of the hall, I turned around just to look back down the other way, and at the doorway of one of the classrooms, it looked like there was something sticking out from the classroom. I asked my friends to also look. Their lights would maybe help see what it was. When all four of us were pointing our phone flashlights toward the door, whatever that thing we were seeing was retracted into the classroom. All four of us quietly went "oh shit" amongst ourselves, and we started running down the intersecting hallway. We stopped when we were far enough away. It seemed we were in the kindergarten wing now. Then we heard another sound echo from down the hallway. It seemed we weren't alone. But who could be in here was the question. The place was locked up and every light in the building was off. The sound scared us into going into the first classroom we could find and shutting the door. It was indeed a kindergarten classroom. We were now concerned we'd get in trouble. so we waited in silence with our flashlights off. The rain was still coming down hard, and there was still thunder and lightning crashing every 20 seconds or so. Suddenly, the door to the classroom clicked open, and someone pushed it as it eerily creaked to a fully open position. We didn't see anyone at the doorway though, and the hallway was almost pitch black. We all tried our best to stay quiet, and then, slowly, something appeared through the doorway. It was the shape of a head. We all saw it, and when there was another flash of lightning, we saw what it was. It was in fact someone's head, looking into the classroom directly at us. I started apologizing for all of us, saying we're leaving. The person at the doorway didn't move. They motionlessly and almost lifelessly just peered around the doorway in the classroom. Eddie asked, "Do you work here?" No response. Eddie had a fuck this moment clearly. He handed me the bat as he struggled to unlock one of the windows to slide it open just enough to crawl through. He crawled out first, then my other two friends, and I was last. Before I crawled out, I looked back one more time at the head at the doorway. I crawled through as quickly as I could, fearing I'd hear the person run up behind me and grab my legs. Once I was out, I ran to catch up with my friends who were already booking it back to Eddie's car. We drove out of there in a hurry and never looked back. The building was torn down later that year and has since been turned into a park. We never got in trouble for breaking in. To this day, we have no idea if that was some kind of worker or just some random person. Either way, it was extremely creepy behavior on their part. When I was a freshman in college, I took a chemistry class. It was really difficult for me. The tables were arranged in groups of 4. I sat at a middle table at the left side all the way to the end. Next to me was a guy named Zach. He was very awkward. He gave me Reddit moderator vibes. To describe his appearance, he was like 5'8", he was a little overweight, and he had a really ugly, patchy beard. But he knew his stuff in chemistry. I think he was just good in school overall. We started to talk in a pretty cordial way when he noticed I sucked in class, and I would ask him for help. He started offering to do my homework for me, and he even let me cheat off him on tests. I never got any kind of flirtatious vibes from Zach, but that might have been because he was just too awkward to flirt in person. He eventually asked for my number so that he could send me homework-related stuff. Obviously, I gave it to him. He was helping me out a ton and didn't give off any threatening vibes. He just seemed a little reclusive. Fast forward to the last day of class, and Zach did something completely unexpected. He asked me if I wanted to go on a date with him after class. I had no physical attraction to Zach in the slightest, and our personalities were complete opposites. But he did help me throughout the semester maintain an A, so I had to let him down super politely. I lied and told him I'm going away to Miami for the next couple of weeks and won't be around. He right away responded, "What about when you get back?" I felt like 2 weeks was long enough of a gap in seeing each other where he would probably lose interest. So I said, "Yeah, I could be around," or something like that. He responded with a really cringy, "Cool," as he nodded his head in response. From here till the end of class that day was really awkward for me. After class, I left straight for my car and drove right home. I was a commuter, not a dormer, so after the last day of class was over, that was it. It was Thursday, and my other friends who went to the same school wanted to go out that night, so we hit town that night, and at some point, I got a text from Zach. He asked, "When are you going to Miami?" I told my friends all about Zach while we were drunk, how he got me an A, but now he wanted a date. My friends joked that I should just go on the date with him to be nice. I joked back sarcastically, "Yeah, for sure." I told myself I'd respond to it later, but I was drunk and completely forgot to. The next day, I woke up to 2 follow-up texts, one with question marks, and then the next one, "You're going to ignore me now that you don't need me anymore, right?" So I replied, "Hey, I'm sorry, I was packing. I'm going to Miami today." He replied almost instantly saying, "Okay." Obviously there was no Miami trip, but he should have never found that out. Later that night, my girls and I went out again, and while out, I got a scary text from Zach saying, "I thought you said you were going to Miami tonight." I almost dropped my drink when I saw this. I showed it to my girls, and they were all freaked out just like I was. I replied to Zach, "What do you mean?" And he replied, "Nothing, forget it. I just don't like liars." I genuinely was scared that I was being stalked. I looked around the whole bar, but he wasn't there. At least as far as I knew. So what the hell? I just didn't answer. At that point, I never planned on answering him again. It wasn't till late that night, shortly after I got home, like literally taking my shoes off inside, that there were knocks at the door. It had to be like 1 a.m. I said, "Who is it?" And it was Zach on the other side. He said, "It's me." I wanted to scream. I was home alone. I yelled through the door to leave, or my dad will come out and kick your ass. That seemed to work, as he didn't knock again. I texted everyone I knew about the situation, my family, all my friends. I was horrified. Some suggested calling the police. I said I would go to the nearest station tomorrow, but tomorrow didn't even come yet, when I received a super long, disgustingly weird and creepy text from guess who. I was appalled when I picked up my phone and read it. This is what it said. "I'm feeling a lot of emotions right now after being used by someone for months and then lied to, and hurt and anger are two of them. I thought from the start of the semester in chemistry class that our chemistry was through the roof. No pun intended. I must say, I am hurt that you would make up something as elaborate as a 2-week-long Miami trip just to avoid going out with me, even after I stuck my neck out for you all semester and risked my own academic standing. I definitely have noticed the way you looked at me sometimes in class, and I can't pretend there wasn't a hint of interest there. All I'm asking for at this point is for one date. That's it. I'm not asking your hand at marriage, though I surely would be quite an ideal husband to have if I do say so myself. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that you needed more time to think over the prospect of going on a date with me. I know how much I have to offer, much more than these losers all over campus. If you want, I can come back to your house and we could talk about it in person. I am only making this offer once. I'm just very crushed to feel like I wasted so much this semester for nothing in return. Yours truly, Zach." I sent this to everyone. I didn't care that it was 3 a.m. I called my dad until he picked up, and I told him how scared I was. After he read the text, he took it upon himself to send Zach a lengthy text of his own, and he attempted to call him like 10 times, but Zach is clearly too much of a coward to pick up that phone call. I also went to the police station the next day with the text saying I wanted to press charges, and one of the people working there said that Zach would be contacted. Zach never picked up any of the calls from the police who were trying to get him to come in for questioning, nor did he answer any of their text messages. Zach completely disappeared. I never heard from him again. Between the police contacting him and my dad's pretty scary texts and voicemails, that basement-dwelling creep probably was shitting himself. Luckily, I never saw him on campus again or anything like that. But I can say, I know what it's like to deal with an actual stalker.
Attention, lockdown, lockdown, lock the doors, stay away from the windows.
Back in 2016, my school went into a lockdown. I was in my senior year and it was the last week of school, so everything was kind of chill and laid back at that point. My friend, who we all used to call Moose, was cutting class with me to smoke in my car in the senior parking lot. One of our friends, Mario, who was in the lunchroom, texted me to come chill with him, so Moose and I started walking back to the school. As we were about to enter through one of the discreet back doors of the school by the band and chorus rooms, Mario texted me saying the school was going into lockdown, and he was right. As we entered through the still unlocked back door, we noticed the red lockdown lights flashing in the tiny band hallway. We walked through the empty hall. This was the quieter section of the school with less foot traffic since we were far from the regular classrooms. I was texting Mario asking him what was going on and if it was just a drill. Moose and I stood in the hallway waiting for an answer. My friend Mario texted back saying, "Dude, holy shit," and the 3 dots bubble meaning he was typing sat under his text for like 30 seconds. Then it went away. He didn't send a second text. I sent him 3 question marks. Moose and I didn't really know what to do. The main hallway lights were shut off, and all that lit up the halls were the backup lights and the red flashing lockdown lights.
There were no teachers anywhere to tell us what to do, so we just chilled in the hallway. We tried opening the doors to the auditorium, but they had already been locked. Moose then tapped my shoulder and pointed down the hallway. All the way down, there was someone dressed in black fast approaching, like speed walking down the hall in our direction. At first it looked like a teacher, but as he got closer, we realized he was wearing some kind of white mask. Moose and I started walking backwards instinctively in response to what we now perceived to be a threat. As he got even closer, we could confirm it was a mask on his face. And it was this horrifying, disgusting mask of some pale, rotting-like face. I'd never seen anything so creepy at any Halloween stores or anything. The man was now too close for comfort, and the way he was approaching us was obviously full of aggression. Moose and I turned and started running back towards the band room. We hoped the band teacher, Miss Bryant, would be in there to let us in. We got to the door, which was locked, and started pounding on it, but we didn't have time to wait. Moose and I split up to hide. I hid in one of the music department closets. I don't know where Moose went. I turned the light in the closet off and hid behind a big container. There was a big glass window in the door to the closet, and I could see into the hall thanks to the little light from the backup lights. I heard footsteps approaching from outside, so I ducked my head completely behind the container. I only looked up and peeked at the window after the footsteps had stopped for a while, and I assumed it was clear. But it was not. The footsteps stopped because the man in the mask was standing at the door, looking in through the glass. I ducked back down, hoping he didn't see me, and then the closet door creaked open. It sounded as though he was trying to fiddle for the light switch, couldn't find it, then gave up. I heard footsteps quickly walk away, matching his speed walking pace from just before. I took out my phone to text Moose to see if he was alright, and I saw I had a long text from Mario. He explained that a student was stabbed in the bathroom by some masked man with a blade. Moose also texted me saying he's alright. He ran back outside to his car. I realized that was a good idea. I made sure the coast was clear and booked it for my car as well. I sat my car in front of the school and watched as cop cars swarmed the place. At least 10 officers entered the building. Moose came to sit in my car with me, and we watched for over half an hour. The school was let out early, with police escorting the kids out, of course. They never even found the masked man in the school. He likely escaped through one of the back doors. There were helicopters searching all day for the man. I'm pretty sure he was never found. I thank my lucky stars I didn't have a similar fate as that kid in the bathroom. I went to a very poor high school in a bad neighborhood. Because of that, we regularly had fire drills and lockdown drills in the case of something happening. During a lockdown, the teacher would turn off the lights and we'd all hide in a corner of the classroom without saying anything. It was a cold day in the third quarter of the school year. The windows were all shut, obviously, but still, my teacher had to stop mid-sentence because we could all hear some kind of shouting outside. Definitely some kind of commotion. My teacher went to the window, looked outside, then opened one of the windows, but the yelling seemed to stop by the time he did. At the same time, the dean started speaking over the loudspeaker and said we were going into a lockdown. My teacher rushed to shut the door and turn off the lights, and we all did our thing, went to the corner of the room. Time seemed to move slow as we were all huddled in that corner. Screams started coming from the hallway. Not the screams of students, but deranged, angry screams from a grown man, familiar to the screaming we briefly heard from outside. Someone dangerous was in the building, clearly. The school I went to didn't have security guards, it was too poor, so literally in a case like this, we'd have to wait for police to arrive. The screams were then accompanied by bangs on a nearby door, another classroom. We could hear the screams of the kids in the room next to us. The banging stopped. The screaming grew closer until it was right outside our door, and then bangs on our classroom door. A couple kids screamed and started to cry. The sick man on the other side of the door banged and banged. He started hitting the glass with his elbow, I think, as he screamed insane things that made no sense to us. Some of it being, "I'm sick of it," and "just stop already." The sickening sound of the small, thin glass window of the door shattering made the reality of the situation sink in even worse. Of course, kids on either side of me were screaming and crying now. Me, I was just sitting there in total shock. The man on the other side of the door stuck his arm into the room through the thin window opening and tried unlocking the door. My teacher took that opportunity to grab a pair of scissors and literally stab the man's arm. The man cried out in pain, banged on the door a few more times even harder now, and started running down the halls, still crying in what was probably a mix of pain and anger. The lockdown was ended a few minutes after police arrived. There had to be at least 6 cop cars outside. And yes, the crazy sicko man was arrested and probably brought to a mental hospital. The man apparently wasn't armed, but he clearly came into the school with intentions of hurting people. Kids, mind you. I went to a school in California. We always had a lockdown drill once a month, but only one time ever was it not a drill. I was in the cafeteria during my lunch period when the teacher, who was in charge of watching the lunchroom, announced over the microphone for everyone to be quiet. He announced to us that the school was going into lockdown and ordered us to be quiet. I think he genuinely scared everyone by how serious and nervous he sounded, because everyone in the cafeteria looked genuinely shook and actually shut up. I looked around the disturbingly quiet cafeteria and could see everyone else was doing the same thing, taking nervous, curious glances at their friends and strangers at other tables. Then shit went down. A gunshot echoed from across the school, and that's when panic set in with everyone. Some kids ran for the exit door. The teacher in charge of the cafeteria yelled at everyone to hide under the tables as he locked the cafeteria doors and shut off the lights. I was sitting under the table with my friends, heart racing, feeling sick, knowing my life could be in danger. Every minute felt like an eternity, just waiting for someone on the intercom to say it's all clear. Then, across the cafeteria, there was a sudden outroar of screams from students, mostly girls, and the sound of tables and chairs being moved or falling over. My friends and I looked out from under the table, and we saw a kid with a gun outside the locked door of the cafeteria. Then I remember hearing gunshots. He was shooting at the glass door. The glass didn't shatter right away. I don't even know if it did at all, but the entire lunchroom cleared out through the 2 side exit doors to the outside. Students of all ages either ran to their cars or off the school property and into the neighborhood streets. I ran in the direction of the front of the school, also the direction of my house. I saw police cars already outside. I think they had just arrived at that point, but I didn't stick around to watch. I got home and told my parents, and my dad turned on the news to see the shooting was already being talked about. Miraculously, only one girl was wounded, and the police somehow apprehended him without killing him. I'm sorry for anyone else who has to go through something like this. Fearing for your life that much is not something anyone should have to go through.
I was 16 in my junior year of high school. I had 9 periods in a school day. 5th period was lunch, and straight from there was my astronomy class. My astronomy class was actually held in one of the 2 basement classrooms of the school. My high school was big, there were 3 floors, and even that wasn't enough to accommodate all the classes offered, so the school built 2 classrooms in the basement. It was honestly kind of creepy down there when nobody else was around. It used to be a janitorial area, however it was remodeled to better resemble a typical hallway. The only thing, there were no intercoms or loudspeakers down in the basement at that time. For that reason, no classes were held down there first period for the morning announcements. Everyone referred to this little section of the basement as the chamber, and everyone always tried to get classes down there just because it was air conditioned and the classes were typically easier. Plus it had its own bathroom down there. We had a quiz in astronomy that day. Usually I was one of the first done just because I found the class easy. After I finished my quiz, I texted my friend who was in the other basement classroom to meet me in the bathroom because I was bored. He told me okay. I walked out of the classroom and down the small hallway to the bathroom. A few seconds later, the door opened and my friend JJ entered the bathroom. We were joking around for a while until JJ checked his phone and said someone texted him saying the school was going on lockdown. We both looked at each other with the same grins. Neither of our teachers saw us leave the classrooms. That meant we had free range of the school while it was on lockdown. We agreed to sneak upstairs and look around the hallways just for the hell of it. The worst that would happen is that we'd explain how we couldn't hear the announcements in the basement classrooms. Upon opening the basement door to the main floor, we were surprised to find all the lights had been turned off, so the hallways were pretty much pitch black aside from the light pouring in from the doors in the lobby. This was legit because usually the lights were left on in the hallways during lockdowns. Something was going down, and we didn't know if we were even comfortable walking around now. JJ stepped out a little further into the hallway, and I followed suit. JJ then looked down the hall and said, "Who's that?" I looked, and emerging from the darkness was a man. At first we couldn't tell if he was a teacher or not, but as he got closer, we realized this guy wasn't dressed at all like any staff member. He was dressed like a bum. "Alright, let's go," I told JJ as we hurried back down to the basement. He surely saw us, whoever he was. We saw both classrooms had their doors shut and lights off, so to avoid making a scene, we decided to hide in the bathroom. I shut the light first thing and then we both went to hide in the corner stall. There was complete silence in the room, no ventilation, no heaters, nothing. Just the sound of me and JJ breathing, and an occasional drip from the sink. The door to the bathroom suddenly opened, and light from the hallway poured into the bathroom for a brief moment. The door shut, and the bathroom was once again pitch black. Me and JJ tried our best to control our breathing. The room was so silent that we could hear somebody walking over to our side of the bathroom. The person stopped and started breathing really heavily, as if they were out of breath. Me and JJ were both scared to death. JJ did something very dumb. He whispered in my ear, "We have to crawl out through the other stalls." The room was so silent, however, that even JJ's whisper could be heard from across the room. The heavy breathing outside the stall stopped, and the person tried pressing the stall door in. That was when I whispered, "Go, go," to JJ. We both crawled under the side wall to the next stall over, and then the next stall, and then finally out to the other side of the bathroom. The person was now full on banging on the stall door. Me and JJ hopped up off the floor, opened the door, and as the light filled the room again, we saw the guy from upstairs in the corner. We pounded on the door to JJ's class. The teacher let us in within seconds. JJ explained everything as the teacher locked the door, mentioning a gun sticking out of the man's pocket. I was shocked to hear this because I didn't see a gun, but I went along with it anyway. Usually a bunch of high school students would be laughing their asses off at two students causing a scene like this, but I noticed all the kids sitting in the corner looked concerned. A sudden bang at the door made everyone jump and a couple of girls squeal out of fear. JJ, the teacher, and I could see the man standing at the door, looking through the window while trying the doorknob. After a few bangs on the door out of what seemed to be anger, he turned and walked down the hallway back to the stairs. We don't know how much longer the lockdown went on for, but for over an hour we sat in silence in the room, other than the teacher occasionally asking me and JJ questions in a very concerned tone, shaking his head after everything we would tell him. Eventually, somebody from upstairs called the teacher and he instructed all of us to single file walk up the stairs and out of the building, where we would be greeted by cops. Me and JJ did the best we could at describing the man to the cops and to the dean. One of the cops patted me on the back and we were sent off to go home. After this incident, the school installed cameras everywhere and ramped up the security budget. This incident never got media attention, so honestly we never found out if police caught the guy. I'm convinced that man had no other intentions but to kill us then and there in that bathroom stall. I'm a retired New Jersey police officer. Throughout my 20 years in the force, the most disturbing call I ever received was for a school lockdown happening at a nearby middle school, of which I'll leave out the name for legal reasons. It happened on a stormy, dark day. My car number was called on the radio to respond to a lockdown, where a suspicious-looking man was seen stepping out from a white van parked behind a school and walking into the back door by the boys' locker room. I pulled up to the back parking lot of the school, right next to the white van. Nobody was inside and all the doors and trunk were locked. I opened the red back door that entered into the gym hallway, right by the locker rooms. The main lights had been turned off, so the whole inside of the school was dark. I unholstered the flashlight from my belt and used it to navigate the halls. I made it to the lobby of the school, where a woman emerged from the front office quietly, telling me to check the boys' locker room, but to be careful because the person might be armed. I called for backup on my radio and was assured backup was already on the way. I made it back to the hallway I entered from, where I found the boys' locker room right next to the exit. I pushed it open very quietly. There were no windows in the rooms, therefore there was no light whatsoever in that locker room. Only the light provided by the flashlight. There was a white noise in the room, some kind of vent on the ceiling blowing air, but even over that, I was hearing faint scratching type noises or little dings on the locker doors from the other side. I was supposed to make my presence as a police officer known, but honestly, I was just too scared. The tension in the room was insane. I held my flashlight in one hand and my gun in the other as I snuck to the other side of the locker room. It seemed like wherever I was in the room, the dings and thuds would be coming from the other side. I was standing in the corner of the locker room, right by the door to the bathroom, when the sound of someone slamming a locker door from another room made me jump out of my skin. I went in the direction where I heard the slam, to find out that it was from the boys' football team locker room. There was no door separating the main locker room from the football locker room. The lockers in here were also 3 times the size. I finally had the nerve to make my presence known by shouting police. After shouting, a kid started screaming help from somewhere in the room. It was very muffled though. The kid pounded on a locker door on the other side of the row I was in. When I found out that the boy was trapped inside of a locker, I felt sick in my stomach. I told him I'd be right back, once again calling for backup while running outside to where the white van was. It was gone. My biggest mistake was not getting the plate number first thing. I told dispatch to be on lookout for a suspicious white van. I ran back into the school and instructed the staff in the front office to end the school day and to send somebody with a key to the locker room to get the boy out of the locker. The boy was held by the man with a knife on his back, as I speculate the man was quietly trying to get the 12-year-old boy to his van. The boy was bleeding on his arm from the man cutting him while resisting. The man's van was spotted a week later in a 7-Eleven parking lot, where he was arrested after being properly identified. I was staying in a Hampton Inn in New Jersey when I was visiting Rowan University, a college I potentially wanted to attend. My family couldn't come with me, so I was on my own. After attending campus tours, I went to get a bite to eat at a nearby restaurant, and then went back to the hotel at around 8 p.m., planning on going back to campus again the next day. About an hour after returning to my room, a strange alarm started going off in my room, along with a white light flashing from the corner of the ceiling. A message started looping shortly after as well, saying something along the lines of, "All Hampton Inn guests, please remain in your rooms, this is a lockdown." I'd never heard of a lockdown in a hotel. I never even knew hotels had alarms like this. I found it more interesting and exciting than anything else. Eventually the sound of the alarm stopped, but the light kept flashing. and every 20 seconds or so the message would repeat. It was only like 9:30, so I turned on the TV just as background noise while I started changing clothes and brushing my teeth. I shut the lights when I was done and hopped under the covers. I watched TV for half an hour before shutting it off. The light was still flashing with an obnoxious bright white every few seconds. It was definitely going to hinder my sleep. I was starting to consider calling the front desk to ask what was going on, when the phone rang. It was someone from the front desk. I was expecting them to tell me something about the alarm and when it would shut off, but instead the person on the other end spoke in a very concerned voice. She told me to remain calm and walk out the door. I took that opportunity to ask her what exactly was going on. She went on to tell me that there was somebody in the room with me and to get out immediately. I dropped the phone and instinctively started looking around everywhere. Part of me was curious to see if somebody was in fact in the room. I checked under the bed, looked into the empty bathroom, nobody in either spot. Then I noticed the closet door right next to the bathroom. It was one of those closets with a wooden sliding door. It was open just a tiny crack, and through that tiny crack, I could see a person's face. At first it didn't sink in what I was seeing, but when the door slid shut, that was when I freaked out and ran out the door. The people at the front desk showed me security footage from an hour earlier of some sketchy looking man walking around the hallways, apparently looking for a certain room. When he got to my door, he opened it with the card he somehow acquired, and that was it. I stayed around as the authorities took the person out in chains. It was a man, of course, on the shorter side, easily 40s. He looked at me as he passed, as if he knew who I was immediately. It's scary thinking back that he may have been watching me for more than an hour from that closet.
Back in college, my junior year, we lived in a suite on campus. There were 4 dorm rooms in this suite. It was half of my friend group in the suite, and we all shared a common room and a small kitchenette. Our friend Cody, who was originally in the suite with us, ended up moving off campus to an apartment with his friend, so the school automatically assigned us a replacement, unfortunately. It was this kid named Rodney. He seemed normal enough. He had blonde short hair, a patchy light beard, almost non-existent eyebrows, and he was really tall. Medium build, but like 6'4". He was in the far corner of the suite, next to my room. We each had our own room, so there was 4 of us in the suite. Rodney seemed to keep to himself the first few days, until one day, I came back from class and he was sitting in the living room. He said he had to tell me something, and then told me he has parasomnia, which was the reason he was transferred from his previous dorm. I didn't know what that was, until he explained that it's a sleep disorder that may cause him to talk or yell in his sleep due to night terrors, and he just wanted everyone in the suite to be aware of it so that we wouldn't feel uncomfortable. But to tell you the truth, that being the first real conversation I had with the guy made me more uncomfortable than anything. I was hoping I'd get to know him on a more personal level, not find out he has a sleeping disorder. I also didn't entirely get why he thought it was necessary to tell me that. I texted in the dorm group chat we made, with Cody still in it, if Rodney had told them as well about his sleeping disorder yet. They all said no, and followed that with laughter and confusion. When my other 2 suite mates got back later, we hung out in the common room and discussed why we thought Rodney's sleep disorder could have been the reason for him to be transferred from his previous dorm. Then, Rodney walked in and right past us after giving us a slight sup. He went to his room and shut the door. We had the TV on loud, so we whispered amongst ourselves about him. That night, I heard a knock at my door in the middle of the night. I asked who it was, to no reply. I ignored it, and I thought to myself, what if it was Rodney? The next day, I asked my friends if either of them knocked on my door last night, and they both texted me saying no. Cody was having a great laugh from all of this. I was already freaked out and was hoping this wouldn't be a regular thing because it was disturbing already. A few nights later, it got worse. It was the middle of the night. I had already woken up, checked my phone, and saw 2 a.m. I heard footsteps outside in the little hallway of the common area, and again, a knock at my door. I didn't answer this time. I knew it was Rodney, and he was starting to freak me out. He clearly was a heavy sleepwalker. I texted the group chat again right then and there at 2 a.m., telling them it just happened again. They didn't respond until morning time, saying they didn't hear anything. It must have been because Rodney's room was right next to mine. That day, I knocked on Rodney's door and asked him if it had been him knocking on my door in the middle of the night. He told me he had no recollection of doing so, but then apologized because he didn't mention that part of his parasomnia is sleepwalking. He told me it was completely harmless and to not worry, but I didn't exactly view it as completely harmless if it was waking me up in the middle of the night, freaking me out. A certain amount of time passed that I can't remember, probably less than 4 days. There hadn't been any other random middle of the night knocks on the door, which I was happy about. But this story wouldn't be told if something else didn't happen. I woke up to noise in my room. I looked around the dark room and spotted Rodney, in the corner of the room facing the wall, muttering to himself. I said Rodney's name, and he turned in my direction and kept saying, "Open the door, open the door." I was genuinely disturbed. He looked in my direction, but it didn't seem like he was looking at me, rather through me. I saw a smile on his face, and I heard what seemed to be a small laugh as he walked out of the room and out of my view. I didn't know if I was supposed to wake him up or not. I know nothing about sleepwalking and sleep disorders. There was silence now. I grabbed my phone and was about to text my friends, but I was interrupted by this deafeningly loud banging on a door outside, accompanied with Rodney's voice screaming, "Open the door." He was screaming it like a maniacal madman. I ran to the common area and saw him at the opposite end of the hall thrashing his fists on one of our suite mates' doors. I ran to Rodney and started shaking him to wake up. My 2 friends came out of their rooms to the commotion as well, and we all started to shake Rodney until he stopped, looked at all 3 of us, and with this blank look on his face, said, "I'm sorry guys," and walked to his room and shut the door. The 3 of us stood there in shock, not even knowing what to say or do. A neighboring room must have called campus police because they showed up at our door. We had to tell them the truth. Rodney spoke with them for a while, then he went back to his room. I made sure not to leave my room unlocked again that night. The next day, Rodney was gone, without a trace of him ever having been there. Like I said, I know nothing about sleepwalking or any of that stuff, but that didn't look like sleepwalking to me. I don't know what was or is currently going on in that guy's head, but he needs to get help. I got along fine with my college roommate Stacy. She was a messy one sometimes, but other than that we had no problems. We'd lend each other stuff all the time. At our school we had bunk beds, which I think are kind of unusual in college dorms. I was on the top bunk because I was the lighter sleeper, and Stacy was always constantly getting up in the middle of the night, so she'd definitely be waking me up if I were on the bottom. There was this one night that still sticks with me to this day, only because I don't really know how to logically explain it. Stacy and I were in our room studying. I was at my desk and she was in her bed. I had a big presentation the next day for one of my classes, so I was just going over my talking points again. In fact, I practiced them to Stacy a few times, and she acted as my audience, then asking questions afterwards. She told me I could borrow one of her tops tomorrow if I need to for my presentation, as I didn't have any nice, formal kinds of tops with me at school. After helping me review, she went back to her studying for a little more, then she went to sleep. I wasn't done studying, but as a courtesy, I turned off my desk lamp and went up to my bunk and kept studying there on my laptop. Stacy would snore sometimes, so when she started snoring, I knew she was asleep. I continued my studying and rehearsing for another half hour to an hour before closing my laptop screen, putting it at the end of my bed, then going to sleep. I woke up at like 5 a.m., when light was just barely starting to creep into the almost pitch black room through the windows. I heard Stacy down below me, walking around. I groggily said Stacy's name, and she answered with, "Mm-hmm." I asked her if I could still borrow a nice top to wear for my presentation later that day. She went, "Mm-hmm," again, and I heard her open her closet door. I said thanks. I looked down at her and saw her bent over in the closet, Then she got out and waved at me as she went to leave the dorm. The sound of the door closing snapped me out of my daze just a bit more. I remember grabbing my phone to check the time, and just to naturally check for any notifications. It was around 5 a.m. I wondered where Stacy could have been going. Most likely the bathroom, like she often would in the middle of the night. The waving was just a bit unusual though. But then I heard a snore from below me in the lower bunk. At first I thought I imagined it. Like, how could that be possible? I peered my head over the edge of the top bunk, and there was Stacy under the sheets. Did I just dream seeing Stacy in her closet? No, because I looked at the closet door and it was still open. I quickly hurried to the door to the room and went out to look into the hallway on both sides. There wasn't a soul in sight, but it had been at least 5 minutes since I heard the door shut. I shook Stacy awake and told her someone was just in our room. It took a few moments for her to fully wake up and snap to reality, which she then showed major concern for and rushed to check her closet for anything stolen. Nothing was stolen though. I still to this day don't know who that was or how she got in. I reported it to university police, but their investigation and review of the camera in the lobby of the building turned up nothing. But I know for a fact it wasn't a hallucination or dream. It was my freshman year in the University of Alabama. I had gotten my roommate's information a few weeks in advance, and his name was Brandon. This was back in 2013. We had been in contact in the weeks before classes would start. However, due to family-related reasons, Brandon had to switch to a different school right before classes even began. So for the first weekend, as everyone else was meeting their roommates, I was unpacking alone, still not yet assigned a replacement roommate. I did meet some of the other kids on my floor though. They were nice. Then, that Sunday night, my roommate arrived. He was walking through the dorm hall with a backpack looking confused, and I asked him if he had just been transferred into this building, and he said yes. I asked him if he was in dorm number 5. That wasn't the actual number of my room, I'm just using that for the story. But he said yes, that was his room. So I shook his hand, gave him my name, and told him I was his roommate. He told me his name was Robert, but to call him Bob. Unusual, I'd never met someone named Robert who preferred to be called Bob. I led Bob to the dorm, in which I had already decorated and furnished on my side. His side was still empty. He plopped his backpack on his bed and looked at me and smiled for a bit, then said in a slight Turkish accent that he didn't have all of his stuff yet. He opened his backpack and pulled out a sheet which he threw over his bed. Since it was already past 9 and tomorrow was the first day of class, Bob and I just sat on our respective beds chatting. I tried to read his vibe at first, as you do when meeting a new person, let alone your roommate. I couldn't really get a good read on him though. He seemed a little quieter. He had this very deep voice and maybe a slightly awkward vibe to him. But I was purposely not judging because people can be nervous when meeting other people for the first time. Anyway, eventually, after talking for a bit, Bob just laid flat on the bed with the sheet on it and used his backpack as a pillow. It looked incredibly uncomfortable. I had no idea how or why he was doing that. I offered him a pillow and he accepted it. I eventually fell asleep past 10. And do you ever wake up to something but you don't know what it was? That happened to me that night. I was confused why I woke up because I didn't hear anything. But that was the freaky thing. It was dead silent in there, not even the sound of Bob breathing. I flipped to my side and screamed at the tall figure looming over my bedside. I came to the realization that it was Bob after he started apologizing and said that he was just going to the bathroom. My heart was beating like it was running a marathon. I couldn't even think to ask him why he was standing over my bed like that if he was just going to the bathroom. He apologized again as he went back to his bed. I told him it's okay. Needless to say, I was wide awake after that. I slept on my side with my back to him the rest of the night though, trying to avoid the uncomfortableness. The next morning, I woke up to my alarm, and I saw Bob was still laying in his bed, likely pretending to be sleeping still. I went through my bag to get my books and such, and I had this feeling in my gut that something was moved in my bag, like it was gone through. I looked up at Bob again, and he was still allegedly sleeping. I decided to take a couple of my more valuable things and throw them in my backpack that I took to class. In class, I emailed the housing department and then submitted a room change request online, stating my roommate made me uncomfortable. After class that day, I returned to my dorm and was confused to notice the door was being held open with a door stopper. I noticed Bob had a big duffel bag on his bed now. I guessed he was unpacking. I laid in my bed on my laptop, and eventually Bob came in. He greeted me and went to his bed, where he took his duffel bag and put it under the bed, and he literally just looked at me with this empty expression. I pretended to not really notice, but his weirdness was really bothering me. I finally looked back at him with not a friendly expression, and he gave me a slight nod. Then he climbed into his bed and just laid there on his phone. Eventually, I went out to the dining hall for dinner. When I came back, Bob was still there. I didn't know what his deal was, if he'd ever leave the dorm or what. I asked him if he had class that day. He said yes, but just one. That night, after turning the lights off, I noticed Bob leaning on the wall in his bed, facing me on his phone. I constantly felt like he was looking at me. I was anxious to get a response from the housing department, so I checked my email and saw they responded, but it wasn't the response I was hoping for. The lady who emailed me back expressed confusion in my request, stating my replacement roommate had not yet been assigned and that there should be no one else in the room with me. I looked at Bob, who looked back at me. I was about to ask him if he had his key to the room on him. I didn't ask that though. I put my laptop and other belongings in my backpack and duffel bag, as he just watched. He didn't say anything, and I think he knew that I knew. I left the room without saying anything, went to a safe place, and called campus police to report him. By the time they arrived to the dorms, Bob, or whatever his real name was gone, along with his little bit of stuff. I found out that night that he stole some clothes from me, my iPhone charger, and some of the food I stored in my closet. As for what he was doing watching me sleep, I could only imagine he was making sure I was asleep before going through my stuff. I had a completely random, possibly homeless person in my room for basically an entire 24 hours. My real roommate moved in 2 days later. My college years were some of the best years of my life. Don't get me wrong, I'm very happy with the life I live, but my memories of those 4 years are eternal. My advice to anyone still in college, don't take it for granted, because it definitely flies by. I went to a beach college. Our campus was literally right on the water. This story takes place while I was undergoing pledge with my pledge class. If you don't know, that's basically a full semester of initiation for everyone who got bids to the frat that semester. Most of what happens during pledge is better left undiscussed. Anyway, it was the last week of pledge before we officially became brothers. Typically, this is the week where the fraternity kicks things up a notch, so to speak. For us, it was commonly understood that at some point during the final week, we'd have to undergo the beach challenge. Here's what would happen. The brothers would drive our entire class about 12 miles down the coast on Friday night. Then we'd have an hour to finish a massive keg filled with God knows what. Then they'd walk us down to the beach, tie all of our wrists together, blindfold us, take our phones, watches, and shoes, and leave us there. We'd have until sunrise to make it back to the house. Otherwise, we'd all be dropped. To be completely honest with you, I was pretty nervous leading up to this, but there was really nothing I could do. There was nothing any of us could do. I remember it being oddly chilly the night of, but the excitement of becoming a brother and finally being done with all this nonsense was adrenalizing. The kegs were the easy part. By this point, we were pretty comfortable with divvying up the alcohol and pulling trig if necessary. There were 15 of us. After tying us together, the brothers blindfolded everyone but Chandler, who was at the very front of the line. He was to be our eyes, but that's all the help we'd get. Our pledge master was this big Mexican guy named Ramirez, but he insisted we all call him Los Pollos, like the restaurant from Breaking Bad. He was a strange dude. He outlined the rules for us one last time, then joined the rest of the brothers and left. We were now on our own. I won't run you through everyone's names, but my closest friends in my pledge class were Chandler, Whitworth, Jackson, and Vikram. I was at the very back of the line, and Whitworth was directly in front of me. We began walking with Chandler leading us. It was hell. Without our phones, there really was no way of telling how much ground we were covering or how much time we had left. All we could do was keep walking. At first, we tried to liven the mood by talking and cracking jokes. but eventually that got old. After what I'll call 2 hours of walking, we were trudging along in complete silence, with the occasional stop for someone to throw up. I started to disassociate. Even the sounds of the ocean grew silent as I walked along, trapped inside my own head. It was completely silent. Suddenly, I felt a sharp tug on the rope around my wrists, so I took a few big steps forward and stopped, assuming Whitworth had fallen. Whitworth was a little more clumsy than most, so this kind of thing wasn't super surprising. I didn't really have the strength nor energy to ask him if he was alright, so I just waited. I must have been standing there like a statue for a full minute. Something felt off. I was just about to say something when the rope around my wrists was pulled tight again. I resumed walking, pleased that Whitworth hadn't passed out. The trek resumed, and I drifted back into my zoned out phase, feeling terrible. I prayed we were closing in on the final stretch. We had to be. Just then, I took what must have been my 10,000th step, but something was different. Instead of hitting damp sand, my foot slapped the unmistakable thin layer of ocean water. I took a few more steps and the water got deeper, reaching up to my ankles. I was confused. Why would Chandler be leading us into the water? The rope pulled tight again, meaning Whitworth and everyone else in front of me was continuing to walk, so I did the same. I guess I figured someone needed to wash off their feet for whatever reason. If no one else was complaining though, I definitely wasn't going to start. The water remained ankle height for a while, advancing and receding with the sway of the waves. Just then though, I felt the water begin to rise again, until it was comfortably around my shins. Chandler was definitely screwing with us, which for the life of me I couldn't understand why. Wasn't the stupid activity painful enough? The water was only going to slow us down. Seconds later, it began to pick up on a faint sound in the distance. I craned my ears and began to recognize it. It was the sound of an idling boat engine. As we continued to walk, the drone of the engine only got louder, meaning it was getting closer, or I was getting closer to it. I was starting to get really uncomfortable. The water was almost up to my knees at this point. Finally, I broke what must have been hours of unspoken silence. Guys, what the hell are we doing in the water? I waited, confused as to why no one was answering me. Guys, I asked again in a more concerned voice. Still nothing. I could feel panic begin to set in. Suddenly, my blindness was suffocating. I had to look around. I reached my wrists up towards my eyes in an attempt to undo my blindfold. As I did so, the rope yanked away from me, forcing my arms back down. I cursed, plunging my head down towards my fingers and undoing my blindfold before the rope could be jolted away from me again. To my horror, Whitworth wasn't the one guiding me. Instead, I found myself staring at a random, middle-aged man holding the frayed end of the rope tied around my wrists. I stared in shock at the severed rope in his hand, and that's when I realized what had done the cutting. A long, rusty kitchen knife sat in his left hand. Past him, there was a boat bobbing in the water, and I could make out 3 more silhouettes towering on board. I screamed bloody murder before he had a chance to react, yanking my arms upward as fiercely as I could. At the same time, I lifted a foot out of the water and kicked his chest with all the strength I could muster. Luckily, the rope broke free from his grip. He grabbed my shirt to try and cushion his fall, but the fabric gave way with a deafening rip. He yelled as he plunged into the water with a huge chunk of my white pledge t-shirt, but I was already moving as fast as I could toward dry land, my wrists still tied. A few seconds passed before I heard a splash from further away. Someone had jumped off the boat. I didn't even look behind me, I just kept moving. I was about halfway to the sand when something whizzed right past my head, maybe a few inches from my right ear. It was the knife. I watched it shoot past me before disappearing into the water. I was in complete shock, but the adrenaline was doing its job. I got to land and for the first time looked back. There were 2 men in the water and 2 on the boat. They weren't chasing me anymore, just staring lifelessly in my direction. The closest man was still holding onto the white piece of my shirt that had torn off in the fray. I didn't waste another second. I ran up the beach and made it to the street. By this point, it was past sunrise, but my frat was the last thing I was thinking about. I flagged down the nearest car, and after pleading to use their phone, called the police. It was no use. By the time the cops showed up, the 4 men were gone, presumably off to wherever in that tiny little boat of theirs. I lied to the cops about what happened, worried that there might be repercussions for the frat. Luckily, they didn't ask questions. I didn't get too much crap from my frat brothers. They were actually more pissed at Chandler for not realizing what had happened, even though he swears he didn't hear a thing. After that, I became a brother, and things went back to normal. Well, normal for a while. A few weeks later, a couple of the guys and I were playing beach die in the sand behind the house when Jackson noticed something in the distance. There was a stick poking out of the sand, and tied to that stick was the white piece of cloth that had been torn from my t-shirt. The design on the ripped stick was unmistakable. It was my shirt. To this day, I have no idea how they knew which frat I was in. My brothers think they might have recognized the piece of my t-shirt, but I have a more sinister theory. I think it's very possible that they knew our frat would be sending us pledges on that beach that night, helpless and blind. I think they very well could have planned the whole thing around that stupid tradition, swooping in and kidnapping whoever they could. I was just unlucky enough to be in the back, which still gives me chills to this day. I still wonder what might have happened to me had I gotten on that boat. The police, as always, were useless. It's been nearly a number of years, and they never found anything. This happened to me about a year ago today, which is why I'm writing about it now. I'm a 19-year-old college student that was in the middle of joining a fraternity on my campus. I go to a big party school down south, and Greek life is taken very seriously there. For privacy reasons, I'll spare the specific details, but this particular night was my initiation, meaning the night that me and my class of 20 students would officially become brothers of the fraternity. During the process of joining, which lasts a couple of months, the brothers would make us do odd things, like blindfold us and take us to strange places. You know, typical hazing stuff. This was one of those nights. We were blindfolded and left the frat house around 10:30 p.m. The brothers took our phones and drove us to a mystery location, split between a couple different cars to make sure we all got there. On the way over, they made us try and memorize some corny song while it blasted on full volume. We always had to do these annoying tasks while blindfolded, I guess as part of the whole hazing thing. Anyway, after about 20 minutes of driving, the car stopped and I heard the doors open and close. I felt a hand grab my arm and silently usher me out of the car. We walked probably 200 feet, where I was then told to sit down and be quiet. I was sitting on grass, so I assumed we were in a field or something. I could also tell I was sitting near people because I heard them sit down, and I also heard the brothers telling each of them to be quiet. After about a minute of sitting in silence, I heard a voice speak to all of us, saying a bunch of fraternity-related things, but mostly about how we were deemed worthy of becoming a part of the Brotherhood. Then, over the course of like 30 minutes, I sat in silence, occasionally hearing the sound of footsteps and movement around me. I figured they might have been doing the final steps of initiation with each person individually, like walking them away to talk to them in private. I didn't know for sure, but being blindfolded meant I was just left to my imagination. There was a time, though, when the footsteps went away, and all I was left with were the sounds of crickets and leaves rustling through the night breeze. I began to grow uncomfortable, as it must have been like 20 minutes that I was sitting there in silence. Then suddenly, I finally heard the footsteps of one of the brothers walk up to me, and I felt a hand grab my wrist and lead me away. He didn't say a word, and neither did I. I just wanted to get it over with so I could take the stupid blindfold off. While we walked, I could feel the ground below me go from grass to more rough terrain. I could tell we were walking through a forest, as I felt branches and shrubs scrape against my body. We were walking for some time, and at one point, the blindfold became very uncomfortable around my eyes. I told him this and asked if we could stop for a second so I could adjust it. He stopped and let go of me. As I stood there rubbing my eyes from under the blindfold, I heard a deep, raspy voice say, "Take it off." I hesitated for a second, not knowing what to say. His voice threw me off, as it didn't sound like a voice I recognized. Needless to say, I took it off, and what I was greeted with was not what I imagined. I was standing face to face with some tall guy dressed in all black, wearing a vendetta mask. I let out a sharp yell and jumped back. A part of me thought this was just some fucked up hazing prank, but before a word could even escape my mouth, he lunged at me, yelling that he was going to take me with him. We wrestled on the ground, and I could tell that he was trying to choke me out. With all my strength, I threw him off of me, got up, and bolted in the opposite direction, using nothing but moonlight to guide my way back. My heart was beating 1,000,000 times a minute, and I kept looking back, fearing that he was following me. I eventually heard people yelling my name, and I nearly ran head-on into one of the fraternity brothers. I told him in scrambled, broken words that some random guy wearing a mask led me into the forest and tried fighting me, but before I could warn them any further, 5 or 6 of them rushed past me with flashlights looking to chase after him. One of them stayed with me to calm me down and walk me back to safety. When we made it out of the woods, I realized we were in a backyard, presumably one of the brothers' houses. I saw nearly the whole fraternity standing out on the porch, looking at us in shock. I asked them what the hell was going on. They said that since it was dark and that I was the last in line, the brother who was supposed to be escorting me somehow overlooked that I was there and completely forgot about me. They said a couple minutes later, one of them thought they saw movement in the woods, which was around the same time that they realized I wasn't in my group. I was in such shock I couldn't even be pissed about it. None of them knew who that man was, but some of the brothers speculated it could have been a brother from another fraternity. Shortly after, flashlights emerged from the trees, and I saw them running back towards us. They told everyone to get the fuck out of there and get back to the campus immediately. We didn't ask questions. They locked up the house, and one of them got on the phone with the police. The whole car ride back I was bombarded with questions, and I answered them the best I could with my mind still racing. I wondered where that man came from, why was he wearing a mask, and what he could have been leading me to. I made up scenarios in my head, like how it could have been a brother from a rival fraternity trying to steal me before I was initiated. That doesn't explain why the brothers locked up the house and called the police, though. I didn't find out until the next day, when one of the brothers who ran after him told me what they found in those woods, and what they found was not what I expected. As they were running, they saw a light in the distance. They grew silent, and when they got closer, they realized it was a bonfire in the middle of a clearing. Standing around the fire were several people dressed in all black and wearing white vendetta masks, chanting and throwing things into the fire. One of the brothers stepped on a loud branch, causing all of the masked men to turn and face them. They froze up, and like something straight out of a horror movie, the mysterious men suddenly started running in their direction. They fled and made it back, where they told everyone else to leave and call the police. It seemed as though we somehow walked ourselves into some cult ritual meeting of some sort. I couldn't sleep for many nights after, and I tried my best to rid my mind of the situation. However, something that I heard from the fraternity a few days later sent shivers down my spine. While a few of them were playing football in the backyard of that same house, they found a white vendetta mask hanging from a tree nearby. They called the police, and the cops took it for evidence and examination. I'm not sure if those guys were ever caught or if the police even made anything of it. I'm also not sure what the hell those weird people were doing in those woods. I've been thinking about this experience a lot recently, and I'm glad that I was left with nothing more than a crazy story. It's been 8 years since I graduated from college. I went to Cooper Union, a small technical school smack dab in the middle of Manhattan. Going to school in New York City was amazing, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. We didn't have many frats back then, so I was sure to join whichever one I could just to ensure that I'd have parties to go to and whatnot. I was a relatively normal kid, so it wasn't too difficult to get a bid. Most of the pledge events were pretty tame, but I would soon find out what they were compensating for. I hope I don't get in trouble for divulging this story, but it happened so long ago that I figure it's safe to talk about. I doubt my old frat is still making their pledges even do this. I certainly hope they aren't. Anyway, the big thing that we do during our initiation was a subway crawl. I can't remember where exactly this was, but there was an old abandoned subway station that teenagers would typically explore. Our frat would make us enter from one of the active platforms, walk to the abandoned one, take some pictures, and then continue to the next active platform. We'd been given subway schedules to ensure that there was no chance a train would come around while we were vulnerable. We'd have plenty of time to get onto the abandoned platform, wait for one train to pass, and then make it to the next station. I know what you're probably thinking, but no, we didn't have to run from a train. The route was planned pretty well, and we all had a lot of leeway when it came to traversing the track. All we had to do was avoid the dangerous third rail and we'd be okay. I had been a big fan of urban exploring before college, so this was honestly more exciting than nerve-wracking for me. It was some random weekday at like 3 a.m. when our frat brothers made us go down into the subway. I'm pretty sure they picked this time because trains were very infrequent and we'd be protected at all costs. There were about 10 of us. I'm telling you, it was a pretty small school. You don't need to know everyone's name, but I should mention that my closest friend in my pledge class was an Albanian dude named Riker. He's the funniest guy you'll ever meet. My friends and I always said he should try and do stand-up comedy. He also smoked a crap ton of pot, which is important for this story. The group of us made our way into the subway unscathed. Riker and I brought up the rear because everyone else was too scared to do so. It was really dark in there, and our frat brothers had only given us 2 flashlights to share. Those flashlights and a single cheap film camera were all we had. At first, I was entrusted with one of the flashlights for being in the back, but I quickly gave it up to one of my pledge brothers who was whining about not being able to see. Not even 30 seconds into the walk, and Riker had his first genius idea. He pulled out a pre-rolled joint from his jacket and grinned, motioning for me to stop. "I don't have enough to share," he whispered, flicking his head in the direction of the other guys who hadn't noticed what we were doing. Against my better judgment, I obliged. Heck, when was I going to get the chance to light up in a subway tunnel again? The 2 of us smoked while we watched the other guys travel further away from us, their echoing laughter beginning to fade out. We finished the pot, and we were a considerable distance behind the pack. Riker's stuff was really strong, and I found myself a little more absent-minded than I wanted to be. My tolerance was definitely not as high as his. The 2 of us picked up the pace to catch up with the rest of the group, but Riker noticed something in our way. We didn't have a light, so all we could see was the silhouette of someone in the dimly lit tunnel lights. I strained my eyes a little more. There was definitely a person in there, just standing motionless in the middle of the track, facing us. It was honestly a little creepy. "David?" called Riker, his voice piercing the silence of the tunnel. The person on the track didn't respond. Just then, David's voice called back to us from further up the line. The 2 of us froze. This person in front of us was a stranger. As if David's voice was some kind of switch, the person on the track started full-on sprinting towards us. The 2 of us turned around and bolted back the way we came. Being as high as I was, I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. The figure's sprint was eerily silent, as if we were being chased by a shadow. This guy must have been impossibly light. Riker's grip on my arm tightened, his goofy confidence completely gone. "Faster," he hissed, the fear in his voice mimicking my own. I knew we still had some time before the next train came, but running in the wrong direction just felt wrong. Riker must have thought the same thing, because he frantically pulled me to the side, motioning for us to cross the divider onto a different track. In hindsight, we probably could have continued running back to the original station, but I was so high that I just followed Riker blindly. We made it across the divider and sprinted back in the direction of the abandoned station. Things were even more terrifying now, though. We had literally no idea when a train was going to barrel down towards us on this track, but at least we were heading in the right direction. I hoped Riker's maneuver was enough to shake whoever was chasing us, but apparently it wasn't. Whoever was behind us also crossed the divider and kept running after us. The problem was there were only a few places where the divider could be crossed, so we'd have to pray we found another one before a train came. Turning around to the one we just used was no longer an option. My heart was thumping, but Riker and I were able to widen the gap between us and our pursuer. We kept running though, looking for a place to cross, but with no luck. Riker started cursing repeatedly, and I started feeling like throwing up. We kept running, still searching for a place to cross. Just then, the track started vibrating, and we could see light beginning to poke through at the distant end of the tunnel. A train was coming. We were screwed. I considered turning around and just fighting whoever was behind us, but then Riker screamed right here, running toward the divider. By some miracle, the next crossing point was right in front of us, and the 2 of us crossed back to the original track. We sprinted like another 30 yards and caught up with the rest of the guys who were on the platform. Riker explained the whole thing while I leaned over and threw up. Not even 30 seconds later, the train on the other track zoomed by. Riker and the rest of the guys were ready to confront whoever was chasing us. No one showed up though. We thought the worst, but just then, we heard another crazed yell from somewhere in the distance. To this day, I still have no idea how that person avoided the train. We waited for the train to pass on our track and then sprinted the hell out of there. In hindsight, Riker and I probably just encountered some homeless guy who was drugged out and might not have even posed a threat to us. The fear took over in that moment though, which I guess explains the stupid decision we made to cross over the divider. I'm sure the two of us also could have fended that guy off, but I'm glad we didn't have to. We took a field trip in middle school to a salt marsh in our town. It was for our science class to study marine life or something like that, I don't even remember. All I remember is we were in teams of 2, and our assignment was to take notes of certain things we could see through our binoculars. I was paired with my best friend Jordan. He and I were lagging behind the group because we wanted to sneak off and do our own thing. So when our teacher, Miss Stern, and the 2 other teachers on the trip with us were far enough away, we turned around on the path and went a different way. The whole salt marsh was just a large maze of wooden walkways built over the swampy waters. The trip was so mind-numbingly boring to us at our young age that we couldn't stand the assignment anymore. We went off to explore down the alternate walkway that we weren't supposed to go down. It had a big sign posted up saying something like, "Don't go down this way unless you work for the town." So guess what we did? Of course we went down this way. There was a lot of super tall grass everywhere, so we were well hidden from the teachers or the rest of the students. We walked for a while, till we passed this little shed-sized building that said "Do not enter" on the door. We tried the door handle, but it was locked, so we proceeded onward. The more we walked and the more turns we made, the more we realized this place was absolutely ginormous and a literal maze. There came a time where we agreed it was time to head back to the group, because we weren't having much more fun ourselves than we would be with the group. Plus, it was getting late and we'd been gone for a while, and we didn't want to get caught, so we started going back in what we thought was the right direction. But after apparently wrong turn after wrong turn, we admitted to each other that we were lost. Any sense of direction now was completely gone, and the sun was clearly starting to go down. Panic didn't set in just yet, but we were definitely worried. Time dragged on, and we couldn't find the damn path back to where we came from. We tried finding that little building that we had just passed as a sign that we were going in the right direction, but we couldn't. The tall, swampy marsh grass was taller than us and blocked sight of everything. The sun was now setting, and there was no way our class and teachers were still here. This was before cell phones were a big thing, let alone among middle schoolers. We had no way of calling for help, but we refrained from screaming until the sun was practically all the way down and panic now started to set in. Suddenly it seemed we weren't alone. Jordan and I started to hear the splashing of water nearby, exactly the sound of someone walking through the probably knee-high water. We started to walk faster down the wooden pathway, and when we stopped again to listen, the splashing was still there, getting louder and closer. We didn't have flashlights, only the moon to light the way. We knew we weren't alone. Something or someone was in the tall grass, hiding, somehow watching us. Jordan basically had a fuck it moment and went to the grass where the splashing was coming from, pushed a bunch of the giant pieces to the side, and then screamed like a little girl. I didn't see what he saw, but I didn't need to. I ran right behind him down the pathway until we both had to stop to catch our breaths. He saw a person hiding in the grass, though I already figured that before he even told me. We kept running and then stopping to catch our breaths until the sound of a helicopter overhead came closer. We saw it, flying over with a searchlight on. We started waving our hands in the air, and whether that helped or not, I don't know, but eventually the spotlight landed on us and stayed there. We expected the helicopter to lower and pick us up because we were idiot little kids. So when it just hovered there, we were confused. But what they were doing was showing where we were to the police search team that came looking for us, after our parents reported to the school that we never came home. We were eventually found by a bunch of police officers and led back to safety. We told them there was someone hiding in the marsh, stalking us, of course. Apparently Miss Stern either miscounted on the bus back to school, or she simply didn't do a head count at all, and the buses left without us. Either way, she messed up big time, and I'm surprised she wasn't fired. This was easily hands down the scariest night of my life, and it happened when I was so young too. In senior year of high school, we took an end-of-year field trip to Boston for our U.S. history class. Part of our assignment was following the Freedom Trail and viewing historical sites like the Bunker Hill Monument. There were of course some teachers and volunteer chaperones on the trip, but between me and my 2 friends Sean and Matt, we were all 18, so we easily convinced one of the more chill teachers to just let us go off and do our own thing. So we strayed off into the city and just messed around having fun checking out the place. We checked out Boston Harbor, where we got food at some waterfront restaurant. Then we checked out the Quincy Market and some other historical landmarks. And then finally we ended up at this little cemetery called the Granary Burying Ground. This is where the horror to this story began. There were of course a few other people in this little cemetery besides the three of us. We weren't exactly that interested in it. We were just walking through it because it was basically one of the major things on the checklist of places that we were supposed to see. Anyway, there was this one guy who caught my attention. He was wearing this old-looking trench coat and a small top hat. It was definitely too warm out to be wearing a trench coat, I know that. He had a gray mustache too, but that's about all I really remember of his appearance. The reason I picked up on him was because he was looking right at me, just standing still. He wasn't walking along looking at the gravestones like everyone else. I said to my friends in a slight murmur, "Why is this guy looking at me?" as I walked past them, making sure they followed me out of there. As we got back to the street, I told them more loudly that I was being eyed down by some weird-looking old dude. Neither of them took notice, but I didn't want to go back to point the guy out, so we kept walking. We were supposed to meet everyone on the trip at the Quincy Market at 5, so we started making our way back there. A few minutes into our walk, I turned around for whatever reason to look behind me, and there he was again. That old man in the top hat not too far behind me. I noticed him through the crowd. He had on his same neutral, almost unhappy-looking face, his gray mustache covering most of his lips. And yes, it seemed like he was looking at me again. He wasn't even moving. I turned back to face forward and didn't see anything. If it happened again, I'd know something was up. And it did. At the Quincy Market, when we were about to meet with the rest of the group, I saw that man again, far away by a street corner, facing me. He almost blended in with the crowd if it weren't for his top hat. I ran up to Sean and Matt and pressed their shoulders to get them to turn around and look. I pointed at the corner that the man was at not even 10 seconds earlier, and he was gone. I told them that that creepy old dude that I mentioned from the burial ground seemed to be following us and kept looking at us, or at me specifically. I have zero clue where he could have went that quickly though. It didn't make sense. That night at the hotel, I was having a nightmare in which I was in my bedroom back at home, and I was hiding under my bed, and I could see feet coming closer to the bed until they stopped at the foot of the bed. And then the man in the top hat looked under the bed at me with his neutral blank expression on his face. I woke up only moments later to a loud thump in the hotel room. I had no idea what it was. I woke up Matt and Sean and the third guy who was in our hotel room, asking if any of them heard that. No one did but me. I still have no clue what that sound was. Years later, I was going through old photo albums with my grandparents around Christmas time, and I stopped on one page where there was a very familiar looking man in one of them. He was wearing a very similar, if not the exact same type of top hat as the man in Boston all those years ago. He also had the same gray mustache and neutral expression on his face. I asked my grandparents who it was, and they told me it was my grandma's father. Now, I'm not saying I saw my grandma's dead dad that day in Boston, but the resemblance was so uncanny that I'm almost positive my mind was playing tricks on me. That whole series of events still freaks me out to this day. This takes place back in November of 2013. I was in the 9th grade, and I went on a field trip with my Boy Scout troop to Alcatraz Island. For those of you who don't know, Alcatraz Island is a famous prison in the middle of the San Francisco Bay. We had the opportunity to sleep on the island in the prison cells. A few of my friends from the troop and I had elected to go, seeing as this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We arrived on a ferry around 2 p.m. or so. Our tour guide was telling us about the history of the island and how there were a couple of men who once managed to escape and tried to swim away, but they were never found. The common belief is that they drowned, which is very likely because not only is it a far swim, but San Francisco is very windy and the water from the bay is super cold, so hypothermia is also a likely cause of death. As the tour went along, my friends and I were joking around about how this place was haunted. To make things even more thrilling, our tour guide decided to wait until midnight to take us to the execution area in the hospital. My friends Ash, Steve, and I kept trying to scare each other every opportunity we got, like I hid behind one of the dark corners and popped out when Steve was approaching. Eventually we made our way to the execution room. Ash and I immediately picked up on how bad it smelled, but nobody else could smell anything, and the guide had said that the execution room hadn't been used in at least 100 years. Keep in mind that Alcatraz has been decommissioned since the 1960s, plus the bodies are taken away after execution, so the smell would only make sense if there were rotting corpses. Sure, there were some bloodstains, but they were like 100+ years old. Ash noted that it was weird that no one else could smell what we had smelled, and I joked around saying maybe some spirit is trying to freak us out or something. We went to the hospital next, and I could have sworn I heard some sort of whispering. Ash and I immediately looked at each other as we heard the sounds, and the lights started to flicker at the same time. The guide told us that the lights always flickered, and then he started to explain how the mentally insane would usually come to the hospital and how there was once this crazy inmate who always would whisper when he spoke. It kind of paralleled us hearing those weird whispering sounds. Later on, a bunch of us played cards in the scout named Kevin's cell. It was definitely quite the experience to play cards in a prison cell, I must say. It was around 3 a.m. when Ash asked me to go with him to the bathroom. I agreed, so we made our way over there. I had finished before him, so I waited outside while Ash was finishing up. I had been waiting for him for a while, pacing back and forth, so I decided to go back into the bathroom and check on him. I could hear the sink running, accompanied by the paper towel dispenser. "Ash, are you almost done?" I asked. The moment I said that, the sink shut off, and I heard a slam from one of the stall doors closing. "Ash?" I called out. No response. My heart froze when the most disturbing sounding cackle I had ever heard in my life came from the stall that had just previously shut. I turned around to make a run for the outside of the bathroom. I screamed for Ash, yelling this isn't funny, and he replied from the other side of the door, "What are you talking about, dude?" He opened the door, but I didn't stay inside of there. I went back outside and told him what just happened. His jaw dropped, and he had the most worried look in his eyes. Then he asked me, "If you were in here this whole time, then what was that breathing I heard outside?" We both realized that something was seriously off. We sprinted out of the bathroom as fast as we could and made it back to the cells where everyone was asleep. We decided not to wake everyone and to just get some sleep. About an hour after falling asleep, I was awoken to the sensation of someone tapping my back. I scanned the room and saw nothing, but I knew I was not alone. With the slightest bit of vision in the dark, I saw something black in the corner of the cell. I let out a blood-curdling scream. My scoutmaster came over and asked me what the problem was. I didn't even know what to say. Needless to say, Alcatraz has a long history, and what my friend and I had experienced was nothing short of paranormal.
I used to be in the Darien School District in Connecticut during my middle and high school days. It was a wealthier district, and a lot of field trips were offered to the students. I was a member of the chorus, and every year we'd take at least 1 or 2 optional field trips as a class. The year in question, in which I was a sophomore, we took a trip to Woodloch Pines Resort in Pennsylvania. The bus ride there took a few hours. I was with my friend Landon. We were going to be sharing a room. From the moment we got there, we figured it was going to be pretty dead. It was November after all, so it was cold up there. We had 3 days planned for the trip, and there were 4 chaperones. They weren't really following us at all times, we just had to tell them what activities we'd be going to do. The first day was fun. Landon and I, along with 2 girls who we were friends with, did some go-karting, rock climbing, went in the pool, and then we went to eat dinner. After dinner, we went back to our room and just hung out for a while. For the record, not all of us students were able to get rooms next to each other. The room was ground level, and there was a clear sliding door that provided a view of the lake down the hill. We went back out for a while, then came back to the room at about 10 o'clock. We left the blinds to the door open because the moon was giving off a cool reflection on the lake down below. Little did we know that would be the start of a nightmare. If I had to guess, I would say it was a whole hour of us just rolling around in both of our beds trying to get comfortable, occasionally talking, before Landon, whose bed was closer to the door, screamed. I had no idea what was going on, why he could have been screaming, or if it was a joke, until I looked at the door. It was a sight from a horror movie. There was a really tall, skinny older woman with long grayish hair standing on the other side of the door.
with her hands cupped up against the glass next to her face, as if she were trying to better see into the room. The woman then walked away. Landon looked at me, I guess waiting for me to get up so he would have the confidence to get up as well and run outside after her. When we didn't see her anywhere though. The cement trail that ran past each and every room of the building was void of any people. There was nobody on the surrounding grass, nor anyone walking down the hill. We both saw the woman though, so we knew we weren't seeing things. The next day we didn't tell any of the chaperones, but we told the two girls who we were friends with. Night came once again after a long day of many activities. We entered the room through the back door and made sure to shut the blinds this time. Landon fell asleep before me. I fell asleep around half an hour after him. I woke up to silence. I couldn't tell if something had woken me up or not. All I knew is that I didn't feel right. I sat up and whispered Landon's name to see if he was awake. He didn't answer, so I turned to the left out of pure instinct and curiosity to look at him. But I couldn't see him. Something was blocking my view of the other bed. I looked up, and towering over my bed was the tall old woman. She took 2 steps back as she said, "Your back door was unlocked," before turning around and walking outside. I was frozen in that bed, except for my shaking. I woke Landon and told him what happened. We locked the back door, shut the blinds once again, and agreed to stay up the rest of the night. It was already 4 in the morning, so we wouldn't be losing much sleep. By 8 o'clock, we went to the dining hall to eat breakfast. When we got back to our room building ready to tell our chaperones, we could see the old woman through the glass of the neighboring room. She was sitting on the bed, hands folded, sitting up straight, facing the door, facing us. We ran to the front desk in the lobby building to report her to the staff instead of the chaperones. It was weird, none of them really knew what to do in the situation. Eventually, we persuaded them to come to the woman's room with us. There, they found the woman sitting in the same position, along with an older man sitting on the other bed, looking up at them as they entered. Apparently, the woman had some kind of mental disorders, but the man wasn't all there either. There was something very off-putting about him, and they just weren't the kinds of people that you'd expect to see at a family-friendly resort. The staff wouldn't kick the two out like we hoped, though, so we told our chaperones. Long story short, after a lot of arguing between chaperones and staff, we had to end the trip early, and we all went home. Me and Landon were just happy to get out of there. When I was in the 4th grade, my class took a field trip to a rural zoo-type place about an hour away from our school. I remember vividly it was a cloudy day with the occasional raindrop or two falling. The zoo was kind of small, but it was kid-friendly. It had a decent amount of habitats, mostly smaller animals though, nothing exotic. There was also a big building as part of the zoo where taxidermied animals were put on display, along with other interesting attractions that I don't really remember. Admittedly, I was kind of off in my elementary and middle school years. I would do weird antisocial things and my teachers and my mom would pick up on it. For whatever reason, when we were touring the building as a group, I decided to walk into one of the bathrooms without telling any of the teachers. I did my business, washed my hands, and entered back out into the hallway. Nobody was around. I walked down one of the hallways we hadn't crossed yet. I still vividly remember the dim, moody lighting and the scarlet red carpets of the hallways. My 8-year-old imagination was going wild as I witnessed all the stiff, lifeless animals that were once alive behind the glass boxes. I stopped in my tracks when I saw some man, obviously hiding behind a stack of chairs. I think I laughed, thinking the man was joking around. He came around from the chairs and walked over to me, asking where the group went. I said, "I don't know." He grabbed my hand and told me to follow him. I must have thought he was taking me back to the group.
He led me to an exit door which led to the back section of the building by a couple of dumpsters, a few benches, and the woods. When we got outside, his tugging became a lot more aggressive, and his grip became tighter around my arm. He was pulling me into the woods. I didn't scream or cry for help, but I remember the feeling I felt in my stomach, like I was so afraid that I could throw up. And then a woman screamed at the top of her lungs. It was one of the teachers on the other side of the fence. The man let go of me and ran into the woods. Moments later, a few of the teachers ran outside the exit door to this side of the fence and pulled me back inside. The teachers all yelled at me, but at the same time comforted and smothered me. They called my parents, and the field trip was officially over. The owners of the attraction called the cops, we all got back on the buses, and we all went home. As my bus was leaving the parking lot, however, my observant 8-year-old self spotted the man crouching down in the woods near the road, hiding behind a branch, watching the buses pass. Once again, for whatever bizarre reason, I kept quiet. I was probably too shy at the time or just too shaken up to say anything. All the other kids looked at me weird the rest of the ride home. I didn't care. But I hope that man never found success in snatching an unsuspecting young child like myself at the time. Back in high school, I took a mysteries and mythology type class, or something like that. I don't remember the name of the class. It basically just had to do with real life mysteries and creepy shit. I was into that kind of stuff. I was taking the class with a good friend, who I'll call Ben for this story. The teacher of the class took us on a field trip to a nearby abandoned village with an unknown past. The village was built in the early 1900s, but seems as though it had been quickly abandoned shortly after it was built. The bus ride there was about 20 minutes. All of us were glued to the bus windows as we pulled up some sketchy-looking, decrepit road cutting through dense forest. The road eventually led to a clearing. We were there. We stepped out onto the road, which had grass growing through the cracks. The grass surrounding was almost knee-high. Then there were the buildings. The tall, archaic brick buildings with the boarded-up windows all gave off such chilling vibes. The teacher lined all 20 of us up, counted heads, and then began leading the way. The point of this little field trip was to use the so-called skills we learned in class to see if we could put anything together about why the village may have been abandoned so long ago. Some of the buildings had holes in the walls to serve as entryways. There were even holes in the ground next to some of the buildings, seemingly dug to get into the basements of some of the buildings, which seemed creepy. There was one building though. It stood taller than any of the others. It just intrigued me the most. While the teacher was leading the group towards the village church, Ben and I decided to sneak off on our own to look for anything interesting. When we walked off in the direction of the tallest building, we saw a hole in the ground. It was dug by the back door of the building, which had been sealed off. In the hole was a ladder which led down to the concrete floor below. We both looked at each other and knew we had to do it. Ben climbed down first, then me. Luckily, this was just around the time Apple started putting flashlights on their phones, so we had a source of light. It was creepy down there. There were a couple of beer bottles, one graffiti tag on the wall, and dusty wooden planks everywhere. There was a wooden stairway which led up to complete darkness, since all windows and doors had been sealed shut from above. We had already gone as far as to enter the building, so we figured we'd go up the stairs too. I went first, and with each step, the creakiness of the 100-year-old wood made me feel as if I was going to fall through each and every step. Ben followed suit. This floor of the building was very tight. It seemed like there were many openings going off into different, smaller rooms. It was so dark in there you would never even guess it was daytime. Ben and I were honestly starting to get creeped out in there and agreed to go back outside. But just then, there was a noise in one of the tiny rooms, like a big rock hitting the concrete floor. A normal instinct would be to run, but Ben and I froze, locked eyes for a moment, then both tiptoed over to the opening of the room. We shined the lights into the room and ran. We ran back down the stairs and then up the rusty ladder back outside. We caught up to the group out of breath. We didn't say anything though to avoid getting in trouble. One of our classmates asked us what was wrong. We told him we snuck into one of the buildings, and in one of the rooms, when we shined the light into it, we saw 3 guys standing maybe 10 feet away from the doorway, facing Ben and I in a weird formation, as if they were waiting for us. As we continued following the group, we paid extra attention to the tall building we entered from the distance, and before leaving, we saw a person's face at one of the higher level windows that had not been boarded up. We never told the teacher in fear of getting in trouble. We didn't know what to think. Were those just homeless people living in there? Were they gang members in hiding? Ben freaks me out with his theory. He says they were ghosts of the people who once lived in the town. Still, the way the 3 guys were just hauntingly standing there so calmly, staring at us the moment we peeked our heads through that doorway, I still can't get that image out of my head. I may go back to that village one day, just to prove Ben's idea wrong.
It was senior year. I had just recently started dating my fiance Mark. We were approaching the end of the school year, and so prom was coming up. I didn't really know if I wanted to go because I had just finally changed all of my contact info, and my family moved to a new house because of my old stalker ex Daryl, who's 4 years older than me. I was 18 and he was 22. We met when I was going through a rough time in my life. Long story, but he turned out to be a psychotic asshole. He got kicked out of the army and started doing hard drugs like heroin. I distanced myself from him as much as I could, but he was relentless. He attempted to break into my family's home at least 3 times, and I had to get a restraining order against him. But my family was worried for me, and for all of us, so we had to move to another house. The reason I was hesitant about going to prom was because I knew my ex Daryl knew about it. We used to talk about going to my prom together. Ever since our move, my friends would drive me home and make sure we weren't followed. I really lived in fear. I was scared Daryl would show up to the prom venue and try to find me. Mark has always been very understanding and supportive, and he assured me he wouldn't tell me to go to prom if he didn't think it would be safe. He made me feel comfortable with it. We and our friends went in a limousine together to the venue, which was a fancy catering hall about 30 minutes away. We all sat at our table and had food and just hung out for a while. Some people went to dance, Mark and I included, for a while. I couldn't help but be paranoid for a while that Daryl was in the building somehow. One of Mark's friends handed me a little shot bottle of vodka and told me it would calm my nerves. I drank it in the bathroom and almost threw up, but within half an hour it really did take the edge off. A few hours later, our group wanted to leave for what's called the after prom, where you basically start drinking and continuing the party elsewhere with your friends. As we walked outside of the venue to our respective rides, I saw one car parked in front of the venue that didn't have its lights on. I didn't know what Daryl drove at that point, or if he drove, but I saw someone sitting in it. They had a baseball hat on and were looking down, so I couldn't see their face. I pointed it out to Mark. He told me to relax, there's no way it's him. We got in our friend's car who was picking us up, and we drove to our friend Melissa's house, who was having a little after party. The whole ride, I kept looking behind us, seeing if we were being followed, but I couldn't tell because there were so many cars on the road. I remember Mark whispering to me, "Relax, everything's fine," and he held my hand, and it helped calm me down so much. We arrived to Melissa's house, and there were already people at her house. At the peak of the night, I'd say there were 20 people there, and everyone was drinking. Eventually, Mark and I wanted to go home, so Mark called his sister to come pick us up, and when she got there, we went straight out to her car. I looked around the street for any sketchy-looking cars, but didn't see anything, and at this point, I officially convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Mark's sister drove us back to their house where I would be sleeping over. It was just his mom and his sister home. His dad is a retired cop, but he was still working at the time, and he was working a late shift that night. His mom was already asleep. It was very late. Mark and I just went downstairs to his room to crawl into bed. The whole den floor of the house was his floor. It had a mini kitchen, bedroom, and living room. His floor was level with the backyard, and so it had a back door. It was a warm night, so some of the windows were cracked open. We were watching a funny movie. That was when we heard a bang on the glass door that led to the backyard. The sliding curtain was covering the door, so we couldn't see who or what did it. I shrieked, and Mark jumped up to open the curtain. No one was on the other side, but there was a post-it note slapped on the door with the word "bitch" on it. He found me. He followed me from the prom to Melissa's house to here, and he probably heard me laughing and knew I was down here. My paranoia was right all along. We went upstairs to Mark's mom's room and woke her up, then called Mark's dad and the police. Waiting for Mark's dad and the rest of the police to arrive felt like an actual eternity. When the doorbell finally rang, followed by loud knocks, Mark and his mom went to go answer the door. It was the police. I had to explain the whole story with my ex, and the restraining order, and now being followed by him here. They asked if there were any cameras on the property, to which Mark's mom said no. Then they asked me if I had any texts from him, or if perhaps I knew where he lived. I told them I didn't have his number anymore, and I had no idea where he lived anymore either. Mark's dad finally arrived on the scene. I took the post-it note from the door home with me to try and compare it to other handwriting from Daryl, and it definitely matched. Mark's dad gave me a ride to my house in his police car so that we could be sure I wouldn't be followed. During the ride home, I called our home phone and my dad picked up. I cried to him into the phone hysterically. After arriving home, my parents were waiting in the front for me. Mark's dad assured my parents we weren't followed. During this period, Mark and I couldn't go to each other's houses. Mark's parents had security cameras installed the same week, and this next part is truly unbelievable. One of the side cameras on their property picked up motion, which alerted Mark's dad's phone. He grabbed his gun and ran outside to the smell of gasoline. He followed the smell until he heard the sound of liquid being poured out of a can, and there he saw Daryl pouring out gasoline on the sides of their house. With his gun drawn, Mark's dad yelled at him to drop the can and put his hands up, and that was the moment Daryl was no longer going to be a threat to my or my loved ones' lives. I call it the sweetest justice that my future fiance's cop dad was the one to arrest my psychotic ex-boyfriend who ruined so many years of my life and had me living in worry. He was sentenced to over 30 years for his crimes, the worst of which of course was attempted arson on a police officer's house. It was 2017. I was 17 getting ready for prom. And of course, girls have it harder because instead of the guys who just rent the same tuxedos, girls have to find a nice dress that they're going to keep. And of course, prom dresses aren't cheap, if you want a nice one at least. My parents didn't want to spend over $200 for a prom dress, so my mom suggested I look online for a used one. She'd even help me. We scrolled on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace, which had just become a thing back then and wasn't as popular as it is today. There wasn't really any luck on Facebook Marketplace, so we mainly searched Craigslist. We found a listing for a dress that we both liked. It was a navy blue evening gown, $50. It said it was worn once for prom. The seller lived pretty close too, so I contacted the number listed on the listing, and in under 10 minutes I got a text back. After expressing my interest and asking a couple sizing questions, the person offered to come to our house to drop it off to us. But my mom said no to having someone from Craigslist come to our house, so I said we'd come to them that day. I asked for their name and they said Alex. Honestly, I assumed that Alex was short for Alexandra. My mom offered to come with me. I felt more comfortable if she'd drive me. When we got to the address, it was a townhouse in a congested area of town. The townhouse was on a dead end. My mom asked if I wanted her to come in with me, and honestly, I don't know why, but I thought it would be embarrassing to go in with my mom. I asked her to just wait in the car unless I text her. I texted Alex, and then I went to ring the doorbell. I noticed all the blinds on the windows were closed, which was strange. It was the middle of the day. The door opened, and instead of some young girl around my age opening the door, it was an actual grown man, like 50 years old. He smiled and asked if I was here for the dress. I said, "Yeah, are you Alex?" And he said, "Yeah." He said I looked just like his daughter, and then said, "Come inside." I looked back at my mom's car and then went inside the house. He said I should be a perfect fit for the dress. He said he'd go get it, then disappeared into another room. The living room was dark and kind of messy. I took out my phone and texted my mom to come to the front door. Then the man called out from a room for me to come inside and try the dress on in front of a mirror. I asked him if he could bring the dress out to the living room. He said there's no mirror in the living room, and I replied that I'd just like to see the dress first. He left the room and entered the living room empty-handed, and said the dress is on the bed in the bedroom if I want to go look at it. I once again asked him to please just bring it out here. Then a knock at the front door. Alex said, "Who is that?" And I opened the door to my mom stepping inside. She smiled and said hello to the man, and he took a couple seconds to say hello back, but without a smile. Now I walked to the doorway of the bedroom, and as I did, he made a noise as if to say, "Don't go in there." I looked into the dark bedroom, and there was no dress on the bed. My mom was in the middle of asking a question when I interrupted and said, "There's no dress." There was a painfully uncomfortable and tense silence, and then the man said, "I'd like you to leave now." My mom and I, without hesitation, left to the car. By the time we were in the car, the front door was already closed, and I saw the man peering through the kinked blinds. We were both in shock. If my mom hadn't come in, I don't know what would have happened. I reported the Craigslist ad. We didn't call the police though, because there was really no proof of anything, and technically nothing happened. But there was no blue dress in that room. He was just trying to get me into that room, and when my mom came in, he couldn't exactly do that anymore. Thank God I listened to my mom and didn't give him our address. I ended up getting a used dress shipped to me. That prom night, I told everyone this story, and it's still kind of haunting even today. In our high school class, there was a kid named Joshua that moved to our high school during freshman year, so I guess he had a hard time breaking into any of the established friend groups. He had a few friends here and there from what I know, but he wasn't part of any particular groups. But then something really awkward happened one day during lunch. I had already asked my date Natalie to prom, and she said yes. At lunch, we had a table of mixed guys and girls, and Natalie was at the table. Here came Joshua from whatever table he was sitting at, and like an awkward scene out of a movie, he tapped Natalie on the shoulder and asked her to prom. The whole table went silent except for one kid who cheered sarcastically. Then Natalie laughed in clear discomfort and said she's already going with me. I felt the secondhand embarrassment. Joshua looked at me, and I didn't know what to think of the stare he gave me, but I could tell he was humiliated. He left without saying a word, and everyone laughed loudly. It was a horribly uncomfortable scenario all around. While I felt bad, I couldn't help but slightly laugh too. I mean, I have no idea what he thought was going to happen, especially with such a large audience of dudes at the table too. We watched as Joshua actually left the cafeteria, and the teacher on lunch duty actually chased after him because you weren't allowed to leave without a pass. But Joshua never came back into the lunchroom. I still wonder where he went from there. On prom night, we had our group of 10 in the back of the limo. The same 10 of us sat at the table together when at the dance. Everything was going as prom should. But then, eventually that night, one of my friends told me, "Don't look now, but Joshua's at that table eyeballing you." I waited like 10 seconds before looking over, and I saw Joshua shooting a dagger at, I guess, Natalie and I. I decided I'd go talk to him, but as I walked over to him, he got up and hurried away out of the dance hall. That was super weird, but I wasn't going to chase after him. I went over to the table he was sitting at and asked a couple of the kids if they came with Joshua, and they said no, he kinda just sat there randomly and wasn't saying anything. I went back to my table, and like a typical high schooler, I told the whole table. It was definitely pretty freakish. After prom, Natalie and I left with a friend who drove to go to a diner to eat a bunch of breakfast food at like 12 a.m. After that, we went to our friend Anthony's house. He had a massive backyard right next to a nature preserve, and he had a really cool fire pit. So we all circled the fire pit with a speaker playing music and some drinks. There were 6 of us total. Anthony, sitting across from me, pointed out to the woods and said he saw something in the woods. We all looked over, of course. We looked at the woods for a while, but when we didn't see anything, Anthony basically said, "Aight, whatever." We continued to hang by the fire pit for a while. Eventually one couple left, so it was just Natalie, Anthony, his date, and myself left. Anthony was mid-sentence when he stopped speaking abruptly. I said, "What?" and I turned around and saw someone walking towards the light of the fire from the woods. It was someone in a tuxedo. He said to us, "Don't get up." As he got closer, we realized it was Joshua. He was holding a hatchet or small axe. He looked like he had been crying, but he also looked angry. Anthony and I told him to please put the axe down and just talk. Joshua yelled at us to shut up, and he made us turn the music off. He began a rant about how soul-crushingly embarrassing what happened during lunch that day was, and how he had been too embarrassed to come back to school after that because he thought it had been spread all over the school, but it really hadn't, and we tried to tell him that. Anytime we tried to speak, he'd scream "shut the fuck up" louder and louder, and he'd begin to raise the axe, kind of. He then directed his attention to Natalie and started going on about how he thought she was gorgeous and that she would only make fun of him with her friends, which again, that never happened. All these things only happened in his head. During this time that he was talking to Natalie, Anthony was low-key and texted his dad something like "bring the gun to the backyard," making it clear we were in danger. Anthony's dad came out to the back door and yelled, "What's going on?" with his gun in his hand. Joshua stopped talking, and I could see he was deciding in his head whether to run or not. He dropped the axe and ran back to the woods. Anthony's dad came running over with his gun, and we all 4 of us couldn't tell him what happened quick enough. His dad said not to touch the axe, leave the fingerprints on it for the police. That hatchet, axe, whatever, was eventually the key to prosecuting Joshua after a few days. Joshua had already been arrested, and so his fingerprints were in the system, and they matched the fingerprints on the axe. But when all 4 of us decided we didn't want to press charges on Joshua, it was too late. By that point, he got charged criminally. Anthony's friend said it was for menacing in the 2nd degree. He didn't serve any jail time. I found Joshua on Facebook shortly after this and reached out to him with a sincere message, not attacking him at all, and he read it. He never replied to it. I saw Joshua one other time in the halls that year. He didn't look at me. None of us ever saw him again after graduation.